The world blurred into a cacophony of sound and shadow, my bones vibrating with a frequency no living thing should ever truly feel. It wasn't a scream that reached me, not a desperate cry for help, but a melody, soothing, beckoning, woven from threads of long-forgotten lullabies and the subtle, insidious promise of peace. It was a siren song, pitched just for me, pulling me deeper into the maw of the woods, a forest I'd once thought of as a playground, now revealed as the gaping maw of a hungry, ancient thing. My hand instinctively went to the scarred leather of my old jacket, feeling the comforting weight of the worn hide, a phantom anchor against the tide of rising dread. My other hand, slick with cold sweat, fumbled for the analog wristwatch I always wore, my thumb tracing the cold steel bezel, a nervous tick that did nothing to ground me now. The voice called again, closer, undeniably female, undeniably hers. It tasted like ash and regret, and I knew with the bone-deep certainty of a condemned man that I was walking straight into the mouth of the beast. But before the whisper became a siren song, before the truth shattered my world like cheap glass, there was a time when I thought my biggest problem was just being a kid in a too quiet neighborhood. Honestly, I think I suppressed that memory for my own sake. For years, it was a blank space in my mental atlas, a faded photograph of a life that felt both intimately mine and utterly alien. The only reason I managed to navigate the sheer, relentless horror that kept dogging my heels was by discarding, piece by agonizing piece, any attachment to a stable past. Last week, it all came flooding back, like a dam breaking after a century of holding back the floodwaters of pure, unadulterated terror. I wish to God I'd thought ahead of time, wished I'd seen the signs, pieced together the puzzle when I was younger, when there might have been a ghost of a chance to escape. But no, the universe, in its infinite, sadistic wisdom, preferred to let me stew in ignorance, marinating in a false sense of security before slamming the door shut. Now, I'm utterly and irrevocably screwed. Ever since I was little, my family, or what I thought was my family, had lived in a fairly decent-sized neighborhood. Not sprawling estates, but comfortable, well-kept houses with manicured lawns and the scent of freshly cut grass perpetually hanging in the air. Even though it was big enough to get lost in, a labyrinth of suburban sameness, everyone seemed to know everyone else. It was that kind of place. Every kid knew every other kid, or at least knew their names and what parents they belonged to. Every parent knew every other parent, often a little too well, judging by the hushed whispers and furtive glances. Sleepovers and cookouts were so frequent, so mandatory, that to an outsider, it probably looked like we were all one giant, harmonious family. The truth, as always, was far more mundane and far more sinister. We were just convenient prey, if you want to get truly cynical about it. Which, by the way, I do. Everything looked perfect from the outside. The kind of place they showcase in glossy real estate brochures, promising picket fences and saccharine sweet dreams. But peel back that thin veneer, and every family had their issues, mine included. Ours were just better at keeping them buried, more adept at maintaining the illusion. There was always gossip and drama bubbling beneath the surface, a low hum of simmering resentments and quiet tragedies. I tried my best to stay out of it, to keep my head down and blend into the backdrop. My natural inclination, even back then, was to observe, to notice the cracks in the facade, rather than become part of the performance. I usually just hung out with my two best friends, James and Brian. They were my constants, my anchors in a world that felt increasingly performative. The three of us were always on some sort of mission. You know, kid stuff, pretending to be elite Army Rangers deep behind enemy lines, daring games of tag that turned into full-blown marathons. Whatever ridiculous scenario we deemed fun at the time, we'd always gravitate towards the sprawling, dense woods that hugged the rear boundary of Brian's property. It was the deepest into the forest you could go without getting truly lost, without stumbling into uncharted territory where the light didn't quite reach. And there, tucked away amidst a cluster of ancient oak trees, was a well, a stone-lined, moss-covered, impossibly deep well. We called it the Wishing Well. I know. Really original. We were 10, for crying out loud. The height of our creative prowess, obviously, despite its oddity, its stark, almost alien presence in the otherwise natural, untamed wild. We paid it no real attention. It was just there. A prop in our endless childhood dramas. A silent, unblinking eye. Then, kids started disappearing. Not in a sudden, catastrophic wave that would shatter the neighborhood's placid facade, but slowly, insidiously, like a drip, drip, drip of leaking terror. You'd think our picture-perfect neighborhood, with its meticulously pruned rose bushes and its overly familiar residents, would be the first ones to be out there frantically looking, organizing search parties, pounding on doors. But we weren't. Not really. At first, it was kids I only knew from the occasional cookout or from the periphery of my classes at school. Acquaintances, not friends, easily dismissed, easily compartmentalized. The parents, of course, reacted, or at least, they performed reaction. Hushed conversations, worried glances across fences, the sudden imposition of new rules. My own parents, with their usual air of detached concern, told me I couldn't play in the woods anymore. For my own safety, my world shrank to the manicured lawns in front of my house or Brian's. James's house was a much farther walk, and since Brian and I lived right across from each other, James would always walk down to our houses. It was inconvenient, but not life-altering, not yet. When I asked my parents if they knew what was going on, if the police were involved, if there were any leads, it was always the same rehearsed answer. I don't know, Leo, but someone dangerous is out there. They'd say it with a practiced frown, a slight furrow of the brow that looked more like an acting choice than genuine worry. Okay then, whatever, I'd respond, shrugging off the vague warnings. They didn't seem truly panicked, not in the gut-wrenching, soul-crushing way parents should be when children vanish into thin air. So why would I? That was the logic of a child, of course. A child raised in a house where emotions were carefully curated, where the facade of normalcy was paramount. A child, perhaps, whose innate survival mechanism was already learning to ignore the inconvenient, the unsettling. Children kept disappearing, slowly but surely, maybe 1 or 2 per year. My memory is hazy on the exact numbers, but it was enough. Enough to draw concern, yes, but never enough to truly shatter the carefully constructed peace. Never enough to truly disrupt the rhythms of suburban life. Not enough to send people into hysterics. Never enough to make anyone truly question the fundamental goodness of the neighborhood. I was fine. My friends were fine. So why should I be concerned? My childish logic prevailed, wrapped in the comforting blanket of self-preservation. When I was 15, though, a flicker of unease began to stir. I started to think it was a domino effect, a strange, collective apathy. No one was panicking, so other people wouldn't panic. If the adults weren't tearing the place apart looking for answers, then it must be normal, or at least normal enough. A chilling thought, in retrospect. But now, all these years later, the full weight of it has landed, and I'm freaking out. I'm utterly and completely losing my mind. Last week was my 17th birthday. 17, a milestone, or so they tell you. Brian, James, and I, having shed the innocence of army men and games of tag, went out into the woods, just like old times, but with a different purpose. We needed a secluded spot to smoke, away from the watchful eyes and hypersensitive noses of our parents. We settled down on a fallen, moss-covered tree by the well, its dark maw still silent, still ignored, still just there. We passed the joint, the acrid smoke catching in my throat, mixing with the damp, earthy smell of the forest. The air was thick with the scent of pine needles and decaying leaves, a familiar smell that now, retrospectively, tasted like betrayal. Not long after we'd settled into a comfortable, hazy silence, Brian and James started fighting. Over what? I don't even remember now. Something trivial, a petty squabble born of adolescent angst and the low-level irritation of a shared secret, but it escalated quickly, their voices rising, sharp and discordant in the quiet woods, irritated by the disruption and the sudden tension. I tried to diffuse the situation as quickly as possible. The last thing I needed was for them to draw attention to us. Both of them, still angry but calmer, sat back down, their shoulders hunched, radiating a sullen silence. We finished smoking, the tension in the air slowly easing as the mild euphoria of the weed took hold. It was time to head back, to blend back into the suburban tapestry before anyone noticed our absence. James, still riled up, an angry energy vibrating just beneath his skin, fast walked ahead of us. He always was the more volatile one. Once he was out of hearing range, his retreating footsteps muffled by the carpet of leaves. Brian stopped me, his hand clamped down on my arm, cold and clammy through the thin fabric of my shirt. I tried to pull away, annoyed, but his grip was surprisingly strong. He turned to face me, his eyes as wide as the full moon that would soon hang in the night sky, reflecting a terror I'd only ever seen in the faces of victims on the evening news. Look, I know it's your birthday, and I know this is going to sound crazy, but I need to tell you something, Brian whispered, his voice raspy, strained. He was sweating profusely, though the evening air was cool, a fine sheen of moisture glistening on his forehead. He ran a hand through his hair, his fingers trembling. I know what's been happening. I know where the missing kids go. I turn 18 next week. Leo, my 18th. And I don't think I'll make it. He trailed off, his eyes darting frantically around the darkening woods, as if the trees themselves had ears, as if the very air could carry secrets. He froze, listening, scoping his surroundings for potential eavesdroppers. The silence that followed was heavy, pregnant with unspoken dread. James was long gone. His footsteps faded into the ambient sounds of the woods settling for the night. Brian leaned in closer, his breath hot and quick against my ear, smelling faintly of old coffee and fear. I heard my parents talking, he resumed, his voice a barely audible hiss. So I sat on the stairs to listen because I thought it was about my birthday present. You know, something big for my 18th. He let out a choked, humorless laugh. They were talking about the well man. About this? Well, he gestured vaguely towards the dark circle in the ground. His voice grew increasingly more frightened, rising in pitch despite his obvious attempts to keep it low. Supposedly, if a parent throws a coin in the well before their child is 18, they can wish for their child to... He trailed off again, unable to finish the sentence, a cold sweat now beading on his upper lip. He looked like he was going to vomit. His eyes were still wide, unblinking, reflecting the last sliver of fading light from the western sky. I felt a cold prickle of unease, a familiar sensation that often accompanied the truly weird things I'd stumbled into. It was the same quiet, insidious wrongness I'd always sensed in the air. Even before I had words for it, a chilling echo of a past I didn't remember but could feel in my bones. But I pushed it down, as I always did. My ingrained cynicism kicked in, a practiced defense mechanism. Chill, dude, seriously. You know how crazy this is about to sound? I replied with a confidence I didn't feel, trying to inject a dose of normalcy into his rapidly unraveling terror. Everything is fine. You're going to be fine. We're going to party till we drop next week, remember? You're turning 18. Man, you're free. You can do whatever you want, I said, trying to sound as convincing as possible, my own voice a little too loud, a little too forced. Even then, My reluctant conscience and that nagging little voice that always dragged me into trouble screamed at me to listen, to probe, to help. But I ignored it. I was good at ignoring things. Boy, was I wrong. About Brian, about everything. The next day, a Saturday, I went to Brian's house around noon. His mother was always up very early, despite her never working. She had this unsettling habit of being up before dawn, meticulously tending to her rose garden, even in the dead of winter. His father worked as an accountant, and it paid pretty well, judging by the size of their house and the new cars in the driveway. But he was never home during the day, always at some client meeting, or so I'd been told. I knocked on the front door, the brass knocker clanking dully against the wood. I waited. The silence of the house was oppressive, thick with an almost tangible emptiness. This was wrong. They always answered. Always. Their car was in the driveway. I knocked again, harder this time, a frantic rhythm against the silent house. Nothing. A cold dread, a familiar serpent, began to coil in my stomach. The air tasted metallic. I knocked again, my fist aching, the sound echoing hollowly in the sudden quiet of the street. Still nothing. My wristwatch, though, still ticked away, a steady, unyielding rhythm, indifferent to the chaos beginning to bloom in my mind. I haven't seen Brian since we went into the woods for my birthday. Not a trace. No calls, no texts, no explanations. And what's worse, no one seems worried. Not truly. They're still going about their lives, mowing their lawns, walking their dogs, the faint scent of charcoal and grilling meat already drifting from some backyard. The neighborhood hums with its usual, saccharine sweet normalcy. It's like he was never here, like he was a ghost, a whisper, a fleeting shadow that simply dissolved into the ether. But I am worried. I'm really, truly worried. I'm panicking. My throat is dry. My palms are slick, and a dull, persistent ache has settled behind my eyes. I'm losing my ever-loving mind, but not because I don't know where Brian is. That's the bitter irony. It's because I know where he is. I know with a dreadful certainty that chills me to the core exactly what happened to him. Last night, long after I'd pretended to be asleep, long after the house had settled into its own quiet, sinister rhythm, I heard my parents talking. Their voices were low, hushed, but the words carried through the thin walls, seeping into my dreams, twisting them into nightmares. My mom is pregnant. Pregnant. The words slammed into me like a physical blow. My parents had me when they were only 19. I'd been told vaguely that I probably wouldn't ever have a sibling. Something about complications, a vague medical reason I'd never truly questioned. I was an only child, always had been, always would be. I was excited to hear the news, a flicker of genuine, unadulterated joy amidst the rising panic over Brian. A sibling, a connection, something normal, until I continued to listen, until their words carved away the last vestiges of my innocence, revealing the raw, festering truth beneath. They're going to kill me and get away with it, just like they did with the others, just like they'll do with anyone who reaches that cursed age. The words uttered in tones as casual as discussing the weather were about a sacrifice, a replacement. If you toss a coin down the well before your child is 18, you can rid yourself of your current child for another. It gives you a chance to try again with no consequence, a fresh start, a do-over, a life for a life, a child for a child like Brian, a child like all the others, a child like me. A cold, clinical horror spread through me, numbing me from the inside out. My family, my parents, the people who tucked me in, who cooked my meals, who worried about my grades. They were monsters, and I was their next meal ticket. I should have listened to Brian. I should have listened to what he had to say. My stomach clenched, bile rising in my throat. I could have run. I could have done something. Anything. It was too late for him, of course, the cold calculations of the well already having claimed him. But if I would have just heard him out, truly heard him, perhaps this would be different. Perhaps I wouldn't be lying here, trapped in my own bed, counting the minutes until my expiration date. But it's not different, and there's nothing I can do. Then, the voice came again, faint at first, a distant echo from behind Brian's house, from the direction of the woods, from the direction of the well. It was soothing, impossibly so, like when my mother used to sing to me, those soft, lilting lullabies that promised safety and peace. But this peace was a lie, a predator's lure. It sounded just like her, exactly like her, a perfect, honeyed mimicry. My hand went to my wristwatch again, my fingers tracing the cold metal, a futile attempt to ground myself against the rising tide of unreality. This was it. The call. My call. I hope she's not out there. I hope, with every fiber of my being, that it's not her. But I know it is. I have to go. I have to. My legs move before my brain gives the order. My reluctant conscience, like my fatal flaw, is dragging me out of the house, out into the pre-dawn gloom. I have to stop this insane, monstrous ritual, or at least I have to try, because that's what Leo Vance does. He tries even when he knows it's futile. He walks towards the fire, because the alternative, turning his back, is a worse kind of death. If I don't come back, if the well swallows me whole, like it swallowed Brian, like it swallowed all the others, then let everyone know. Let them know what happened. I know what happened. I know what happened to all of the missing children. And I know why no one in this perfect, horrifying neighborhood ever had a sibling. Total characters, 9,879. The sticky, cloying scent of overripe pumpkin pulp, fermented and sweet, mingled with something sharper, something metallic and undeniably visceral. It was a smell I knew far too well, a vile perfume that had followed me across countless state lines, a harbinger of the grotesque. The woman, or what was left of her, hung from the porch swing, a macabre scarecrow dressed in cheap, tattered black fabric, a ridiculously oversized witch's hat askew on her head. Her face, a mask of terror stretched taut and frozen in death, was already starting to bloat. A faint purplish discoloration creeping up her neck. A thick, viscous liquid, not pumpkin guts, but something dark and syrupy, seeped from the crude stick that wasn't a broomstick at all. It was a jagged, crudely sharpened pole driven clean through her chest, pinning her to the rotting wood. Dellen, the picture-perfect town that supposedly forgot Halloween, had just thrown the most elaborate, most horrifying party I'd ever had the distinct misfortune to witness, and I was, as usual, the unwilling guest of honor, the only one present who understood that this wasn't some local tragedy. This was just another Tuesday. It had all started so innocently, with the pumpkins, a slow, insidious creep of vibrant orange into a town that prided itself on its quiet, almost aggressively normal existence. I'd rolled into Dellen a month ago, the rust-flecked paint of my old pickup truck still grumbling from the last cross-country haul. I was looking for nothing more than a few weeks of blessed anonymity, a brief port in the perpetual storm of my life, and a paycheck from the night shift at the old cannery on the edge of town. Dellen had seemed ideal, tucked away. No real draw for tourists, just a sleepy little dot on the map where I could lay low, pretend to be just another tired man clocking in and out. I hadn't expected the storm to brew right here. Under the guise of an autumn harvest, Dellen was a place that almost hurt to look at with its pristine lawns, its neatly trimmed hedges, and houses that looked like they'd been plucked from a postcard. Cozy, the locals called it. I called it suspiciously quiet. My old analog wristwatch, a nervous habit, felt heavier on my wrist than usual in this almost oppressive stillness. My worn leather jacket felt too conspicuous. The town, I'd learned quickly, had a peculiarity. They didn't acknowledge Halloween. Not a single plastic spiderweb, Not a grinning jack-o'-lantern, not even a whisper of the word. They just skipped October 31st. They loved autumn, though. They'd wax poetic about the crisp air, the kaleidoscope of leaves, the smell of wood smoke curling from chimneys, all the comfortable, non-threatening parts of the season. It reeked of suppression, like a collective, tightly wound spring. That sort of forced normalcy always put me on edge. Experience had taught me that the things people tried hardest to ignore were usually the very things that demanded to be seen. The pumpkins began their insidious invasion not with a bang, but with a whisper of green. They sprouted everywhere, in the front yards of perfectly manicured homes, on the grassy islands and roundabouts, even sprawling across the fields near the elementary school, their verdant tendrils creeping out of the rich, dark soil. At first, Dellen's residents, bless their naive hearts, found it charming, a quaint organic decor, a surprise gift from Mother Nature. I saw them point, smiling, cooing over the unexpected bounty. Me? My gut twisted. Nothing that appears so suddenly, so universally, and so perfectly in an otherwise tightly controlled environment is ever a gift. It's always bait. The air, though growing colder, felt strangely thick, almost viscous, especially around the burgeoning patches. A faint, earthy sweetness, like decomposing leaves in damp soil, hung heavy, an overture to something far less bucolic. I found myself instinctively checking my old wristwatch more often. The tiny tick-tock, a futile attempt to impose order on a world that was clearly losing its mind. The first hints of orange appeared, then exploded. Soon, the entire town was awash in the plump, undeniable gourds. From the porch of the small, dusty room I rented from Eliza, a woman whose eyes held a permanent tremor of suppressed anxiety. I could count dozens, maybe hundreds. Quite the prank, isn't it? Eliza had chuckled one morning, her voice thin. She was one of the few who seemed truly uneasy, her nervousness a familiar echo of my own deeply buried dread. Her home, unlike most in Dellen, felt slightly off, not haunted, not yet, just a quiet tension, like a string pulled too tight. Prank? I'd grunted, stirring my lukewarm coffee. My internal monologue, as usual, was far more cynical. Nobody plants this many pumpkins as a joke. This isn't a senior class project. It's a goddamn agricultural apocalypse. Seems a bit elaborate for a few bored teenagers. Eliza? She had simply nodded, her gaze fixed on a particularly large specimen near her rosebush. Her face, usually pale, looked almost translucent in the morning light. Her hands, clasped together, had a faint tremor. Dellen, meanwhile, embraced its new identity with disturbing zeal. The pumpkins became the town's singular topic of conversation. The local diner, a greasy spoon I frequented for its anonymity, started churning out pumpkin-spiced everything. Coffee, pancakes, even a pumpkin burger that made my stomach curdle just thinking about it. The bakery had pumpkin biscuits, the candy store pumpkin caramels. They were omnipresent, an orange tide slowly rising, swallowing Dellen whole. People began to harvest them, excitedly bringing them indoors, decorating their porches, even trying to carve faces into them. The irony, given the town's aversion to Halloween, was sickening. I found myself sketching in my small notebook more and more, not the typical monsters of my memory, but the unnervingly perfect spheres of orange, trying to capture the subtle wrongness that pulsed beneath their cheerful exteriors. It was a new habit, one I'd picked up to try and externalize the horrors I saw, to pin them to a page where I could at least pretend to control them. Eliza, my landlady, became increasingly agitated. She refused to bring any pumpkins into her home, her eyes darting nervously whenever one was mentioned. I'd seen her flinch when a neighbor offered her a carved jack-o'-lantern, a genuinely friendly gesture that had her recoiling as if from a venomous snake. "They're multiplying," she'd whispered to me one afternoon, her voice barely audible, her gaze fixed on the burgeoning patch across the street. In Mrs. Finley's meticulously maintained front yard, Mrs. Finley, the local busybody, was already a legend in my short time here for her over-the-top gardening and even more over-the-top complaints about stray leaves on her sidewalk. I tried to dismiss it, to offer some semblance of comfort. It's just growth, Eliza. They grow fast. But she shook her head, her eyes wide, a raw fear blooming in their depths that I recognized instantly. It was the fear of a rabbit cornered by a fox, the kind of primal terror that gnawed at your insides. It was the look I saw in the mirror on bad nights, when the memories, vague and indistinct, of the fire in the Sycamore Grove incident threatened to break through the carefully constructed amnesia. She clearly saw something I didn't, or wouldn't allow myself to see, something far beyond simple agriculture, that nagging spark of conscience, that damnable trait I despised in myself, flared. I couldn't just leave her to her terror. Not yet. The rattling noises started shortly after that, a subtle undercurrent at first, barely noticeable. I was on the night shift, stocking cans of peaches and corn in the cavernous, echoing warehouse. The air was thick with the metallic tang of machinery oil and the dusty sweetness of dried fruit. Sometimes, when the industrial fans whirred down, I'd hear it, a faint, almost delicate clatter, like dry gourds bumping against each other, carried on the anemic breeze from town. I'd pause, hand hovering over a box of diced tomatoes, my head cocked. My old wristwatch, its luminous dial a tiny green beacon in the dimness, was checked, then checked again. 2 a.m., 3 a.m., the witching hours. I dismissed it as squirrels or raccoons, or maybe the cannery's ancient pipes groaning in the cold. But the sounds persisted, growing bolder, punctuated by something else, a faint, high-pitched giggling, like children's laughter carried on a capricious wind. It wasn't the innocent sound of kids playing. It was thin, reedy, too joyful, too knowing. It scraped at something deep inside me, a primal unease that resonated with the forgotten horrors of my own past. My gut clenched. This is why you don't stay anywhere too long, Vance. This is why you keep moving. One night, the laughter was closer, too close. I was lying in bed, the flimsy curtains doing little to block out the oppressive darkness of Dellen after midnight. The window was directly above my head. The rattling started, not just one or two, but a whole chorus of them, accompanied by a soft, rhythmic thumping. Then the giggling, clear as a bell, right outside my window. My blood ran cold. My go bag, always packed and ready by the door, seemed a million miles away. This wasn't some local wildlife, not some drunk teenagers. This was organized. My body froze, every muscle taut. I strained my ears, hearing distinct, light footsteps crunching on the dry grass. Too many sets of feet. My eyes, opened just a sliver, caught a flicker of warm, orange light outside, like dozens of candles had been lit simultaneously. The silence in Dellen was usually so profound, you could hear the blood rushing in your own ears. Tonight, it was punctuated by this unnatural symphony of bumps, thumps, and unsettling laughter. My curiosity, a fatal flaw that often overrode my survival instincts, got the better of me. I slipped out of bed, my feet meeting the cold wooden floor with a soft thud. I moved like a ghost, low to the ground, my worn leather jacket pulled tight around me, its familiar weight a meager comfort. I crawled to the window, slowly, agonizingly slowly, pulling back the edge of the flimsy curtain just enough to peek. The street was empty, deceptively so. The only light emanated from across the way, from Mrs. Finley's house. It was bathed in an eerie, flickering orange glow. And then I saw her, Mrs. Finley herself, hunched low in Eliza's front yard, a glint of metal in her hand, a knife. She was cutting one of the pumpkins, the one Eliza had been so wary of, the one near the rose bush, the largest, plumpest one. My stomach dropped. And then, as if on cue, she stopped, her head, incredibly slowly, lifted. Her eyes, even from my darkened window, even in the dim, flickering orange light, seemed to pierce through the night, through the glass and through the flimsy curtains, and right into my skull. My heart hammered against my ribs like a trapped bird. I was in a dark room, practically invisible. There was no way she could have seen me, but I felt it. The cold, unblinking focus of her gaze. Mrs. Findlay, in daylight, was just a shrill, complaining old woman. But now, bathed in the strange, pulsing light of the pumpkins, her face a pale, unreadable mask. She was something else entirely, something ancient and predatory. I ducked back, a wave of nausea washing over me, scrambling back to my bed, pulling the threadbare blankets over my head. I squeezed my eyes shut, trying to convince myself it was a dream, a trick of the flickering light and my overactive imagination. Just a dream, Vance. Just a dream. But the cold dread that seeped into my bones was all too real. It was the same cold dread that had taken root in my childhood. After the fire, after Sycamore Grove, a phantom limb of fear that still throbbed, waiting for triggers like this. I didn't speak to Eliza about what I'd seen. The words felt too heavy, too impossible to voice. I almost succeeded in bearing the memory, until the insistent ring of the doorbell shattered the morning's fragile peace. My hand, without thinking, went to my wristwatch, thumb tracing the cold metal of the bezel. Then, an idiot impulse. I strode to the door and pulled it open, only to be greeted by the unnervingly wide, yellow-tinged smile of Mrs. Findlay herself. She was holding a pie, still steaming, radiating a heavy, sweet aroma of cinnamon and something sickly earthy. Pumpkin pie. "Morning, dearie," she chirped, her voice too sweet, too light. Her eyes, those cold, piercing eyes from the night before, glinted with an almost unnatural delight. "I was baking all morning and thought I'd bring you some. Fits the season, doesn't it?" She winked, a slow, deliberate movement that sent a shiver down my spine. My mouth felt dry. I stood there, mute, a knot forming in my stomach. What do you say to a woman you saw committing an act that felt profoundly wrong, who now stood on your porch holding a baked offering? Before I could stammer out a response, Eliza materialized behind me, her face even paler than the previous day. She held herself rigid, her hands clasped tightly in front of her. "Oh, Mrs. Findlay," Eliza managed, her voice strained, a polite mask barely concealing the terror beneath. "How thoughtful. But really, you shouldn't have. You see, I'm quite allergic to pumpkin. A terrible shame, isn't it?" She already had her hand on the doorframe, ready to close it, to put a barrier between herself and the unnerving woman on the porch. The sheer force of her unspoken fear was palpable. I could feel it, a cold, clammy presence in the air. "Nonsense!" Mrs. Findlay's voice cut through the strained politeness, sharper now with an edge of something insistent, dominant. "Let your lodger enjoy it then. He looks like he could use a good meal, doesn't he?" Her gaze, too knowing, too deliberate, swept over me. The pie, the smell of which was now making my head swim, was pushed forward. It did smell good, in a sickening sort of way. Like the best pie you'd ever eaten. A forbidden fruit, perfectly crafted to tempt and deceive. Eliza hesitated, her eyes wide with internal conflict. But Mrs. Findlay pressed the hot tray into her hands with such an unyielding, determined force that Eliza had no choice but to accept it. Without another word, Mrs. Findlay simply turned, a wide, unsettling smile still plastered to her face, and walked back to her house. The silence she left behind was heavier than any sound. Eliza slammed the door shut the moment Mrs. Finley was out of sight. Her hands trembled as she clutched the pie tray. She walked to the kitchen, almost at a run, and without a moment's hesitation, lifted the lid of the trash can and dropped the entire pie inside. The soft splat it made was the only sound in the tense quiet. "Do not talk to that woman again. Leo, not a word. Do you understand?" she demanded, her voice tight with suppressed panic. She rarely used my name. "Eliza, what the hell is going on?" I finally managed, my own voice rougher than I intended. "I saw her last night, outside, with a knife." "What was she doing?" Her head snapped up, her eyes wide and piercing, the tremor in her hands now a full-blown shake. "What did you see? Was it just her? Or did you see anyone else?" The questions came in a rapid-fire whisper, laced with an urgency that chilled me to the bone. "It was just her," I lied, conveniently omitting the giggling and the faint, glowing lights, the memory of which still prickled my scalp. "Just her, cutting a pumpkin. Why are you so freaked out? What's going on?" Eliza sagged against the counter, letting out a long, ragged sigh that sounded less like relief and more like a surrender. She tried to smile, a grotesque distortion that tugged at one side of her face. "From now until November begins, you will not leave this house when the sun goes down. Leo, not for work, not for anything. Do you understand? I'm going to the shop now. Get some supplies. You stay here. Wait for me." She didn't wait for an answer, didn't give me a chance to protest. She grabbed her keys, her purse, and almost literally stormed out the door, the sound of her hurried footsteps fading quickly down the street. I was left alone in the house, the metallic tang of something akin to fear hanging in the air, a familiar taste. Eliza didn't return until the afternoon, just as the sun began its slow, inevitable descent. The moment she was back inside, the house took on the atmosphere of a bunker. She hadn't been alone in her apprehension. She'd apparently spoken to others, perhaps even to my employer. She'd made arrangements for me to not come into the cannery for the next few nights, citing a sudden, mysterious illness. My cynical mind scoffed at the flimsy excuse, but my deeper, more primal instincts understood. They worked quickly, almost frantically, sealing the house. Heavy, dark fabric was tacked over every window, plunging the rooms into a perpetual twilight. Locks, already sturdy, were reinforced. Furniture was pushed against the doors. The transformation was swift and chilling. My go-bag was still by the door, a silent accusation of my foolish lingering. "What is happening, Eliza?" I pleaded, the weariness in my voice giving way to a flicker of genuine alarm. I felt like I was trapped in a play, a grim, absurd drama, and I hadn't even been given a script. "Can you please talk to me? You're acting like the apocalypse is coming." She looked at me, her eyes heavy with unshed tears, her face a map of exhaustion and terror. "There's a reason we don't celebrate this month in Dellen. Leo," she whispered, her voice barely a breath. "Because when we do, when we invite it in, there's someone else who joins us." She paused, her gaze drifting to the darkened windows, as if she could see through the heavy fabric. "Someone we never, ever want to see." Her voice hitched, a sob catching in her throat. "It seems someone invited them back this year, honey, but don't worry. They'll be gone again soon." That was all I got, a vague, unsettling prophecy of doom. After the house was secured, Eliza reverted to a semblance of normalcy, a chillingly forced performance. She cooked dinner, a bland, tasteless affair. We sat at the kitchen table under the flickering, incandescent light, and she spoke of trivial things, avoiding my every attempt to bring up the suffocating weirdness that now defined our existence. I ate mechanically, my gaze constantly drawn to the obscured windows, the heavy dread coiling tighter in my gut. It was late, past midnight, when the noises returned. I was in the living room, trying to read a dog-eared paperback, Eliza dozing fitfully in an armchair opposite me, The air was thick and heavy, the silence inside the house almost suffocating. My analog wristwatch felt like a dead weight. Then, a faint rattling, the soft, rhythmic thump, and then, the giggling. This time, it wasn't distant, it was right outside the walls, almost directly behind the makeshift curtained windows. It was no longer just Mrs. Finley. I heard distinct, multiple voices, hushed and full of a dreadful glee. They sounded like children, unnatural children. Eliza's eyes snapped open. She sat bolt upright, her hand flying to her mouth, her eyes wide with naked terror. She held a trembling finger to her lips, a silent command for me to be quiet, as if any sound from us would pierce the flimsy veil of safety we'd constructed. Even I, cynical and jaded, felt a tremor run through me. This wasn't a prank. This was a siege. The noises grew louder, bolder, the rattling, like handfuls of dry seeds being shaken in an invisible gourd. The thumping, rhythmic and dull, as if something soft and heavy was being gently bumped against the outside walls. And the laughter, now clearer, higher pitched, laced with a chilling, predatory joy. It was right outside our door. Then a soft scraping sound, like fingernails dragging on wood, followed by a loud, deliberate knock, thump, knock, and another, thump, knock, and another, thump, knock. It wouldn't stop. They were at the windows now too, the soft scraping sound moving from pane to pane, like an unseen hand tracing the outlines of our prison. I wanted to believe it was just a local Halloween prank gone horribly wrong, a collective effort of Dellen's frustrated teenagers. But the look on Eliza's face, a mask of pure, unadulterated horror, told me otherwise. This was something far, far worse. This was the thing Dellen tried to ignore. And it had finally arrived. Time stretched, became meaningless. Minutes, hours, I couldn't tell. The relentless knocking and scraping continued, a terrifying lullaby from the encroaching darkness. My hand found my wristwatch, tracing the face, a desperate attempt to ground myself in something real. Finally, blessedly, the sounds faded, receding into the night. When the silence returned, it was a heavy, oppressive thing, thick with unspoken dread. If you knew this would happen, I managed, my voice raspy, alien in the quiet room. Why didn't we leave? Why didn't you all just pack up and get out? Eliza turned to me, her eyes brimming with tears, a single droplet tracing a clean path through the dust on her cheek. Because we can't. Leo, she whispered, her voice breaking. Nobody leaves Dellen once October starts. Not really. The chilling finality in her voice sent a fresh wave of dread through me. Nobody leaves Dellen. I thought of the vagueness of my own past, the fuzzy edges of memory around Sycamore Grove, the constant pull to flee, yet the uncanny way I always found myself drawn back into these inexplicable horrors. Was it a curse, a magnet for the macabre? Or was I, too, trapped in some larger, unseen web? The idea was a bitter pill to swallow. Morning arrived with the same oppressive, unnatural silence. The first rays of sun, a pale, anemic light, filtered through the gaps in the fabric. Eliza, moving like an automaton, began to remove the dark coverings from the windows. As the fabric came down, revealing the world outside, I felt a fresh wave of sick disbelief wash over me. For a moment, a perverse part of me almost believed it had all been an elaborate prank, an insane psychological operation by Eliza in the town to teach me a lesson about the sacredness of Dellen's traditions, about the forbidden holiday. It felt like a perverse, cruel joke. My anger flared as I looked across the street, directly at Mrs. Finley's house. What I saw made my blood run cold, then boil. It was unrecognizable, hauntingly beautiful, undeniably macabre, and decorated with a lavishness that mocked Dellen's purported ban on Halloween. Carved pumpkins, Hundreds of them, glowing with an internal, flickering light, lined the porch, the walkway, the roof line. Poisoned-looking red apples, like drops of blood, hung from the skeletal branches of the trees. Gossamer spiderwebs, impossibly large and intricate, clung to every surface, catching the anemic sunlight. The lawn was a graveyard, dozens of crudely fashioned gravestones jutting from the earth, each with a name scrawled on it, too faint to read from this distance. Skulls, bone-white and grinning, were assembled in neat, geometric patterns all around the house. It must have taken all night, an entire crew working tirelessly. I recognized the meticulous precision of Mrs. Finley's own obsessive gardening, warped into something grotesque. And then I saw the centerpiece, a figure hung from a thick rope on the porch, a witch, dressed in all black, with a tall, pointy hat and a broomstick clutched in its hand. It was too large for a typical Halloween decoration, too lifelike. A sticky, dark liquid, glinting wetly, was dripping from the end of the broom. It looked like blood. My cynical heart gave a tired thump. Of course it does, Vance, of course it does. I walked out of the house, drawn by an unwilling, morbid curiosity, my hand going to my wristwatch, checking the time that no longer seemed to matter. Dellen's other residents, a small knot of them, stood transfixed, staring at Mrs. Finley's house, their faces a mixture of shock and dawning horror. I got closer, the sweet decay of pumpkin and that familiar metallic tang growing stronger. My boots crunched on fallen leaves, on something else, a small orange shard of pumpkin skin, stiff and cold. My eyes fixated on the dripping liquid. It didn't just look like blood. It was blood. Dark, viscous, pooling on the porch planks. And the witch wasn't holding a broom. The stick, splintered and rough, was pierced clean through the figure's hand, through its chest. The last horrifying realization hit us all like a physical blow. The small crowd, previously murmuring, fell silent, a collective gasp. This wasn't a decorative witch hanging from a rope. It was Mrs. Finley's dead body, posed, impaled, and offered up like a grisly sacrifice. The smile on her face, that unnervingly wide, yellow-tinged smile she'd given me when she offered the pie, was still there, stretching her lips in a grotesque rictus. Mrs. Finley's house was the first. It would not be the last. The orange tide had reached its zenith, and the unspoken rule of Dellen had been shattered beyond repair. Eliza's words echoed in my mind, a chilling prophecy. When we invited in, there's someone else who joins us. And now they were here. The town that meticulously erased Halloween from its calendar had, paradoxically, created the perfect, isolated playground for something truly ancient and hungry to finally feast. Dellen, the cozy, quiet little town, was no longer quiet. It was screaming, and I, the weary wanderer, was once again caught in the middle of it. Another fresh layer of trauma settling over the old, indistinct scars. My past, that shapeless horror that had driven me to this life of constant flight, felt more present than ever, a silent companion to the new, orange-tinged terror. Total characters. 9940. The dimple was wrong, not the faint, endearing indentation that creased the left side of Mike's face when he genuinely smiled, but a deeper, unsettling gouge, carved unnaturally into his right cheek. My heart, already a frantic drumbeat against my ribs, plummeted into the pit of my stomach, dissolving whatever brave facade I'd tried to construct. The tiny, almost invisible constellation of freckles that usually dusted the bridge of his nose were gone, erased by an uncanny smoothness of skin. And his eyes, Mike's eyes, were a pale, almost crystalline blue, like ice on a winter morning. These, though the right shade, held a flat, lifeless quality, like cheap glass marbles. He was skinnier, too, his clothes hanging looser than they should. And the way his skin seemed stretched taut over his cheekbones, almost too pale, too perfect, sent a shiver straight down my spine. This wasn't Mike. This was a grotesque, living forgery, a piece of art meticulously crafted from a blurry photograph in a deeply malevolent intent. But to understand how I found myself staring into the unsettling mimicry of a man I had loved, paralyzed between flight and confrontation in a bustling cafe, you have to rewind 6 weeks. 6 weeks since I last spoke to the real Mike, since I tried to sever the painful, tangled thread of a relationship that was doomed from the start. And since the first unsettling vibration of my phone late one Saturday night, I remember that night with a clarity I usually reserve for the faces of the things that haunt my nightmares. My new apartment, a sterile box on the wrong side of town, offered little comfort. 2 weeks I'd been there. 2 weeks trying to forget the familiar ache of Mike's absence. 2 weeks telling myself I'd done the right thing. He'd kept me locked out of his life for the entirety of our 2 years together. A ghost in his own narrative, afraid to let his friends or family know he was anything other than what they expected. And I, being the fool I am, had tolerated it, holding on to the crumbs of his affection. It was a pattern of my life, a grim comedy where I kept stepping into the same trap with different bait. My old analog wristwatch, a battered relic that probably kept time more out of spite than precision, showed 2:50 a.m. I was trying to lose myself in the predictable drama of a vampire show on Netflix, the flickering blue light of the screen doing little to soothe the restless hum beneath my skin. Just when I thought I might finally drift off, my phone buzzed on the bedside table. I almost ignored it, assuming it was a misdial from some late-night drunk. But then I saw the name. Mike. My stomach clenched, a familiar mix of hope and dread coiling within me. Saturday, 4:51 a.m. Mike, are you awake? I stared at the screen, a bitter laugh bubbling up in my throat. Are you awake? Of course I was awake. I was always awake. I was a man perpetually running on fumes, a transient shadow in a world too bright and too loud. Sleep was a luxury and usually a trap. Me, why are you texting me? I typed, my fingers hovering over the send button. Part of me, the part I hated, wanted to type. I miss you too. Wanted to ask, are you okay? But the other part, the cynical, self-preservative part, slammed the door shut. He'd shut me out for 2 years. He didn't get to waltz back in at 3 a.m. Mike, I miss you. Another text. My jaw tightened. The words felt hollow, like a bad actor reading lines. This was a game, a manipulation. I knew Mike, or I thought I did. He wasn't usually so direct after a breakup. He preferred to ghost, to make himself scarce, letting the silence do the talking. This felt clumsy, desperate, and maybe, just maybe, I was desperate enough to believe it. My stupid, soft core, the reluctant conscience that always seemed to drag me into the path of speeding trains, was whispering. He's hurting. Maybe he's finally ready to talk. Me, whatever game you think you're playing, I'm not interested. If you're drunk and need help, I can book an Uber for you. Otherwise, don't text me again. I hit send, the finality of it a cold comfort. A heavy silence followed. No response. Good or bad? I wasn't sure. I tossed the phone onto my bed, a sigh escaping my lips, thick with exhaustion and a familiar sense of self-loathing. Mike was probably just looking for a late-night hookup, a warm body to fill the void, and I, like an idiot, had almost let him. I tried to focus on the TV, on the manufactured angst of fictional vampires, but my mind kept replaying the messages, the phantom ache of a love I knew was toxic but couldn't quite excise. I eventually drifted into a fitful, shallow sleep around 5. The next morning, the city was already stirring, a low, mechanical hum seeping through my thin apartment walls. My head pounded with the dull rhythm of too little sleep and too much emotional baggage. I grabbed my worn leather jacket. It smelled faintly of stale coffee and desperation, my scent, and headed out. Brunch with Sarah. She was my anchor, the one person who saw through my cynical armor to the wreckage beneath. Without her, I often wondered if I'd simply float away, a detached observer of my own slow unraveling. My old wristwatch, a nervous tick now more than a timekeeper, felt cool against my wrist. I checked it, then again. 9:47 a.m., already late. Sarah was already at our usual little cafe, nursing a cup of tea, her expression a mix of concern and exasperation. Nothing ever got past her. She took one look at my bloodshot eyes and the tremor in my hand as I reached for the menu. "You look like death warmed over." "Leo," she said, her voice soft but firm. "Don't tell me you were binging TVD again. You only do that when something's eating at you." I offered a weak, practiced smile. "Just had to finish some work, you know? Deadline." Then couldn't shut my brain off. It was a lie, a flimsy shield against her relentless perception. But what was I supposed to say? Oh, just my dead-to-me ex-boyfriend, stirring up old wounds with cryptic texts from beyond the grave? Our coffee arrived, a dark, steaming lifeline, and I practically inhaled the damn thing. The bitter warmth scalded my throat but grounded me slightly. Sarah's gaze, steady and unwavering, was a physical weight on me. "Lee," she pushed, using the nickname only she was allowed. "I know you, and I know when something's bothering you. Talk to me." Sarah had never been Mike's biggest fan. Rightly so. He was a manipulative enigma, and she'd seen it long before I had. That's why it was so hard to open up about him. Even to her. I knew she wouldn't judge me for my feelings, but I wasn't sure she'd understand why. I still harbored them. Why his texts had ripped open old scars. The truth was, I still cared. A lot. And admitting that out loud felt like admitting a weakness, a fundamental flaw in my hardened exterior. But looking at her, seeing the genuine concern etched on her face, the words started to uncoil. I pulled out my phone, my thumb hesitating over the screen, before I finally navigated to the messages. I handed it to her. She read them, her brow furrowing slightly. Then she slowly handed it back. A silence stretched between us, thick with unspoken questions. I braced myself for the lecture, the inevitable. "I told you so." "You know," she said eventually, her voice barely above a whisper. "It's okay if you still care about him. I get that. I do. Do you want some advice, or do you just need someone to listen?" Her words hit me like a physical blow, the sheer, unexpected kindness of it. I had this miserable habit of assuming the worst from people, even those I knew loved me. Trauma does that to you. I suppose it teaches you to expect betrayal, to anticipate the blow. I hadn't even realized I'd been holding my breath until it left my lungs in a ragged sigh. "Advice," I managed, my voice raspy. "Please." She reached across the table, her hand warm and firm over mine. "Like I said, it's okay to care. But Leo, I don't think it's a good idea to let him back into your life. Not after everything. Ultimately, it's your call, but given his track record, I would highly recommend against it." "Thanks," I mumbled, squeezing her hand. "I know. I feel like we never got the closure we needed." The words tasted like ash. Closure. What a joke. I'd secretly hoped, for weeks, that he'd show up at my doorstep, begging me to take him back, finally ready to admit he was wrong, ready to be with me. But I'd moved. He didn't know my new address. It was impossible. A small part of me, the part that still believed in impossible things, mourned that. "If that's what you need to get over him," Sarah said, a sympathetic tilt to her head, "then go for it." We talked for a while longer, the mundane rhythm of brunch a strange balm to the churning turmoil within me. Eventually, we said our goodbyes, and I walked home, the city noise a dull roar in my ears. My apartment, when I finally reached it, felt smaller, colder. Buster, my scruffy terrier mix, greeted me with an excited whirl of tail and a happy yelp, his nails clicking on the laminate floor. He was my one constant, my unshakable point of light in a universe determined to drag me into the shadows. I bent down, bearing my face in his scruff, inhaling his familiar dog scent, a comfort beyond words. "Hey, buddy," I murmured, scratching behind his ears. He licked my face enthusiastically. "Good boy." I dropped my keys on the kitchen counter, the dull clatter echoing in the quiet. The rest of the day crawled by, uneventful save for the nagging thought of Mike. That night, I succumbed to exhaustion, drifting off on the couch while a movie played unheeded on the television. My old watch glowed faintly in the dim light. Its hands, unconcerned with the horror they might witness, ticked steadily towards the witching hour. Sunday, 3:03 a.m. My phone dinged, tearing me from the shallow depths of sleep. I fumbled for it, my eyes gritty, the screen burning white in the darkness. "Mike, I know you said not to text you again, but I really need to talk to you." I sat bolt upright, the remnants of sleep fleeing like startled birds. 3 in the morning. Again. A cold dread began to seep into my bones. A familiar, unwelcome guest. Me. What could you possibly need to talk about at 3 in the morning? I typed, my fingers trembling slightly. This wasn't right. This wasn't Mike. Not the Mike I knew. Anyway, well, not the one who hid from life. Not the one who pursued it with this kind of unsettling tenacity. "Mike, I don't mean right now, but in person. I don't like how we ended things." My heart skipped a beat, then hammered against my ribs. In person. Just yesterday, I'd been talking to Sarah about needing closure, about wishing he'd show up, and now this. It was too much of a coincidence. My observational skills, honed by years of trying to see the subtle wrongness in the world, screamed at me. This was uncanny. This was wrong. But that damn reluctant conscience, the fatal flaw in my programming, overruled my better judgment. The part of me that still craved resolution, still longed for the version of Mike I'd conjured in my head, started to take over. My phone dinged again, jerking me from my internal debate. "Mike, can I see you?" The words were simple, innocuous, yet they felt laced with menace. My mind raced, weighing options. I could ignore it, block the number, but then, would I ever know? Would that craving for closure fester, leaving me in this perpetual state of limbo? My cynicism, usually a heavy blanket, felt thin, porous. "Me, fine. You can come over tomorrow. But I recently moved. It might be a bit of a drive for you." I typed, my hand shaking slightly. The sheer recklessness of the decision made my head spin. I was inviting trouble, directly to my doorstep. My go-bag was in the closet, ready for flight, but I was instead choosing to stand my ground. Stupid. Leo. So utterly, fundamentally stupid. "Mike, that's all right." A simple response. No questions about the address, no surprise. Just that flat, unnerving acceptance. I texted him my new address, my stomach churning with a mix of fear and perverse anticipation. He replied with, "See you soon." The screen went dark, and I sank back into the couch cushions. The silence of the apartment suddenly amplified, heavy and waiting. I didn't sleep a wink after that, just lay there, eyes open, watching the pre-dawn light creep through the blinds, painting the room in shades of bruised purple and gray. The sun had just begun to paint the sky with thin strokes of orange when I finally gave up on sleep. I made myself a cup of stale coffee, my lifeblood, and managed to choke down a piece of toast. The idea of seeing Mike, or whatever this was, in a few hours, sent a cold knot tightening in my stomach. Was I actually going to do this? Was I going to invite whatever sick game this was into my fragile existence? I decided to take Buster to the park. The cool morning air, tinged with the scent of damp earth and exhaust fumes, felt like a slap in the face. I walked the familiar route, Buster trotting happily beside me, occasionally tugging at his leash. The park was still mostly empty, save for a few dedicated early risers and their dogs. I sat on a lonely bench, watching Buster chase a squirrel with an innocent joy I envied. My thoughts spiraled, a vortex of anxiety. What if we just ended up sleeping together, reigniting a toxic flame? Or worse, what if we actually got back together, consigning me to another 2 years of emotional purgatory? Then it happened, that familiar, prickling sensation on the back of my neck. Like invisible eyes were boring into me. I scanned the perimeter, my gaze sharp, honed by years of hypervigilance. Nothing, just the rustle of leaves, the distant drone of traffic, but the feeling persisted, a cold, insidious dread. It was like I was being watched, but barely. A subtle wrongness, a disturbance in the normal hum of the morning. My eyes darted to a gnarled oak tree a few benches away. Had something shifted behind it? A flash of dark against the pale trunk. I squinted, my heart thrumming. No, nothing. Just the play of light and shadow, my sleep-deprived mind playing tricks. Or so I tried to tell myself. The thought of the man I was supposed to meet, the one who wasn't Mike, sent a fresh wave of panic through me. "Come on, Buster, time to go," I called, my voice rougher than usual. Buster, ever obedient, bounded towards me, tail wagging furiously. I scratched his head, slipped him a treat, then clipped on his leash. The walk home felt endless, the air suddenly thick, heavy. Every shadow seemed to stretch and writhe, every rustle of leaves a whispered warning. The feeling of being watched clung to me like a shroud. I was practically vibrating with unease by the time I reached my apartment building. Relief, a fleeting, fragile emotion, washed over me as I fumbled with the key to my deadbolt. But it didn't last. My phone buzzed as I stepped inside, the familiar chime echoing in the quiet. I glanced at it, my heart seizing in my chest. A Facebook message. From Richard, Mike's older brother. My breath hitched. Sunday, 10:17 a.m. Richard. "Hey, Leo, it's Richard. I'm not sure if you remember me. We met at Mike's party a few months ago." I remembered, barely. Mike had introduced me as a friend, a casual dismissal that had stung at the time. My hand, steady for a moment, began to tremble. Me. "Hi, yes, I remember. What's up?" I typed, my mind racing. What could Richard want? Did Mike finally tell him about us? Was he angry? Relief, cold and immediate, flooded me when I saw the next message. No, this wasn't about us. It was something else. Something far, far worse. "Richard, this might be a bit overdue, but honestly, between the funeral and the grieving, it's been kind of hard to get the news out to some of Mike's newer friends. I just wanted to let you know he passed away last weekend." The words blurred on the screen, a punch to the gut that left me breathless. Passed away last weekend. My mind, usually so adept at compartmentalizing, at shoving unpleasantness into the dark corners of my psyche, simply short-circuited. Last weekend. That meant Mike was dead. Before the first text, before the "I miss you," before the invitation to meet in person, I almost typed, "Are you sure?" But luckily, some shred of decency, that reluctant conscience again, stopped me. Of course he was sure. This was his brother. This was real. The bile rose in my throat, hot and acrid. Mike was dead, gone, and I hadn't even known, because he'd shut me out. The irony was a bitter, painful taste on my tongue. Me. I'm sorry for your loss. Thank you for taking the time to let me know. Sorry if this comes across as insensitive, but can I ask who currently has his phone? A stupid question. An insensitive question. But the dread was a physical thing now. A clawed hand gripping my insides. If Mike was dead, who was texting me? Richard. We never found it. Actually, it probably got lost in the accident. Did you need something from it? Never found it. The answer echoed in my head, a chilling confirmation of my worst fears. There was no Mike. Only this imposter. This thing that had his phone. And that thing had my address. My new address. The one I'd given it just hours ago. Me. No. He just had a few photos from an old trip with some friends. But it's not important. A clumsy lie. My mind was reeling, trying to connect the dots, trying to find a logical explanation for the impossible. A sick prank? Someone had found his phone and was messing with me? But the cold dread that was spreading through me felt far more insidious than a simple prank. It felt predatory. Richard. Well, I'll let you know if it ever turns up. Me. That won't be necessary, but thank you. I practically threw the phone onto the couch cushion. What the hell? My brain scrambled for rational answers, but there were none. Only the horrifying, undeniable truth. Mike was dead, and something else was wearing his digital skin, hunting me, and it had my address, my new, supposedly safe, anonymous address. Panic, cold and sharp, seized me. I had to go. Now. No time for logic. No time for explanations. Just movement. Flight. My go bag, always packed for moments like this, was already in the closet. I grabbed it, then Buster's carrier, my hands fumbling with the buckles. My first thought was Sarah. She was the only person I trusted. The only one who wouldn't immediately dismiss my wild ramblings as a stress-induced delusion. I called her, my voice thin, ragged with fear. Sarah, I gasped. I need a place to stay. Now, for a few days. Something's happened. I can't explain. She didn't hesitate, didn't even ask for details. Just that quiet, reassuring strength that made her my indispensable anchor. Of course, Leo, my spare room's open. Stay as long as you need. Just get here safely. Thank God, I breathed, the words almost a sob. She was a lifesaver, maybe even literally. I wasted no time, stuffing a few last-minute essentials into my duffel, grabbing Buster, and bolting out the door of my supposedly safe haven. The anonymous apartment, meant to be a fresh start, had become a tomb. I drove like a man possessed, the worn leather of my jacket a familiar comfort against my racing heart. The rearview mirror was a constant source of dread, every passing car a potential threat. I was being paranoid, I knew, but in my life, paranoia was often just extreme vigilance. When I arrived at Sarah's, the late afternoon sun was already dipping below the horizon, casting long, unsettling shadows. She met me at the door, her face etched with worry. Buster, sensing my agitation, whimpered softly in his carrier. Lee, what's going on? She asked, her eyes scanning my pale face. I think I have a stalker situation, I said, the words tasting like ash. And I need to move again, permanently. She ushered me inside, her concern deepening. You need to call the police. Leo, now. I nodded, though the thought of explaining this twisted nightmare to a police officer, detailing how my dead ex-boyfriend was texting me from beyond the grave and now knew my address, filled me with a fresh wave of nausea. They'd think I was crazy. They'd send me for a psych evaluation. I knew the drill. It was why I never went to the authorities. They rarely believed the truth, especially when the truth wore the skin of the impossible. But what choice did I have now? After a silent dinner, Sarah set me up on her couch, a makeshift bed of cushions and blankets. Buster, curled protectively at my feet, was the only thing that kept me from fully fracturing. Sarah excused herself, heading to her bedroom, the soft click of her door echoing in the suddenly vast silence. Sleep, of course, was an impossibility. My old wristwatch, its faint tick-tock, a relentless metronome of dread. Ready 11:37 p.m., hours until the witching hour. I lay there, staring at the ceiling, my mind a chaotic whirlwind of grief and terror. I pulled out my phone, scrolling through old photos of Mike, the real Mike, his laugh lines, the tiny crinkle at the corner of his left eye when he smiled, the subtle shift in his posture when he was trying to hide something. The pain of his loss, now truly cemented by Richard's message, was a raw, aching wound. I couldn't believe he was gone, and I couldn't believe someone, or something, was sick enough to pretend to be him, to mock my grief. The tears, hot and stinging, tracked paths down my temples into my hairline. Then, a sudden, sharp ding from my phone, not a text message, an app notification. My stomach did a violent somersault. It was from the doggy cams I'd set up around my apartment for Buster. I'd installed them when I moved in, just to check on him if I was out late. A new layer of paranoia, born from years of unsettling experiences, that now proved grimly prophetic. Movement detected in living room. The words burned into my retina. My throat closed, a wave of cold nausea washing over me. Every instinct screamed at me to throw the phone away, to curl into a ball and disappear. But that damn reluctant conscience, coupled with a morbid curiosity I deeply regretted, forced my hand. I had to see. I had to know. My heart hammered against my ribs, a frantic, desperate drum. I opened the app, my thumb slick with sweat. The screen flickered, the grainy night vision image of my living room resolving itself into horrifying clarity. There, standing in the middle of my living room, was a man I had never seen before in my life. Not truly. He was a scarecrow of a man, impossibly thin, as if he hadn't eaten in weeks. His hair was dark and long, hanging in greasy, lank strands around a face that was gaunt, sallow, not Mike's short punna blonde hair, but the shape of him, the lean frame, the way he held himself. It was an echo, a distorted shadow. And the eyes, the dark, empty pools of his eyes seemed to be staring directly into the camera, directly at me. He didn't look right. Every cell in my body screamed wrong, wrong, wrong. Then a faint, almost imperceptible ding from my phone. Not from the app. A text message. My eyes snapped to the notification bar. Monday, 3:09 a.m. Mike, where are you? My breath hitched, a strangled gasp tearing through my throat. I slammed the doggy cam app shut. The image seared into my mind and practically threw my phone across the living room. It skittered across the polished wood floor, coming to rest against a discarded shoe. Buster, startled by the sudden movement, woke with a panicked yelp, scrambling to his feet. I managed to calm him down with a shaky hand, but the bile was already rising in my throat, hot and acrid. I scrambled off the couch, tripping over my own feet, and stumbled towards the bathroom, barely making it to the toilet before my stomach convulsed. I must have woken Sarah. The light in her bedroom flickered on, a thin sliver beneath her door. I heard her stir, then the soft padding of her bare feet on the carpet. "Leo, what's going on?" Her voice, laced with sleep and concern, floated through the thin bathroom door. I was emptying my stomach, the dry heaves racking my entire body. Every meal I'd eaten in the past week seemed to make a reappearance. It took an eternity for the vomiting to finally subside, leaving me weak and trembling, slumped against the cool porcelain. At some point, Sarah had come in, her hand gently rubbing my back, a calming rhythm. "Ugh, he's in my apartment," I croaked, my voice raw. "What? Who?" Sarah sounded utterly bewildered, as if she thought she was dreaming. The stalker, the guy who's been texting me through Mike's phone. I saw him on the dog cam. He's there. Now. I recounted the terrifying image on the app. The gaunt face, the wrong hair, the empty eyes. I told her about the text message, the chilling precision of the timing. She stared at me, her face pale in the dim bathroom light. "You have to check the app again. Leo," she said, her voice firm. "No," I begged, shaking my head. "Please, Sarah, I need to sleep." "We can deal with this in the morning. I'll call the cops. First thing. I promise." She hesitated, her gaze searching my face, assessing the raw terror etched there. Finally, she nodded slowly. "All right, but you call them. No excuses, and we're sticking together. You're sleeping in my room?" I didn't argue. I crawled into the futon Sarah had set up in her room, Buster curling up next to me, a warm, solid weight, despite the terror. I eventually drifted off, exhaustion claiming me. I woke up groggy and disoriented. The room was bright, sunlight streaming through Sarah's window. My old wristwatch showed it was almost 10 a.m. Sarah was gone, presumably at work. A crumpled note lay on her dresser. "Had to go to work. Tried waking you up earlier, but you wouldn't budge. Also, don't forget to call the cops. Breakfast in the kitchen, XOXO. Shit. Monday at work." I'd completely forgotten. 20 missed calls from my boss. My life was falling apart, piece by piece. I fired off a quick email with some lame excuse about a sudden, virulent illness, begging for tomorrow off too. Then, I trudged into the kitchen. Sarah, bless her, had left a plate of eggs and bacon covered in saran wrap. Sometimes, I wished I was wired differently, just so I could marry Sarah. She was the best of us. After breakfast, I called the police. The conversation was exactly as I'd feared. Disbelief, thinly veiled skepticism. They'd send an officer to check out the apartment, but I'd have to go there to show them the dog cam footage, the text messages, and explain everything. The thought of exposing Mike's death, of explaining our secret relationship to his family through a police report, made my stomach clench. It was a ridiculous thing to worry about given the present danger, but the fear of being outed without consent was a deep, visceral one. Just as I was steeling myself for the inevitable, another message notification snapped me back to the present. My blood ran cold. Monday, 11:42 a.m. "Mike, I thought we were supposed to meet up yesterday." This was the first time it had texted me during the day, during Mike's waking hours. My breath caught in my throat. I knew a lot of people would say that it probably knew where Sarah lived now too, and that thought sent me spiraling. I needed to get out of here. If it was a person, a stalker, maybe it wouldn't do anything in broad daylight, surrounded by people. If I went back to my apartment, at least the police would be there. I told Sarah's landlord I had to run an errand, then headed to my car, Buster trailing behind me. I couldn't risk him, not with whatever malevolence was lurking in my apartment. I dropped him off at a doggy daycare, giving him a long, reassuring hug, promising I'd be back. His trusting eyes filled me with a fresh surge of resolve. I had to end this. On the way to my apartment, I decided to stop for coffee. I needed the caffeine, a desperate attempt to jumpstart my exhausted brain. The cafe I wanted was on a busy street, no parking nearby, so I had to find a spot a couple of blocks away. As I walked, the oppressive sense of being watched returned, a cold, clammy hand on my spine. I quickened my pace, my eyes darting nervously around. There, just up ahead, I caught a glimpse of a figure, a man, tall, slender, and then I saw it, or thought I did, a flash of dark, long hair. My breath hitched. No, not here, not now. I spun around, a jolt of raw terror shooting through me, ready to bolt. That's when I bumped into Mike. Except, it wasn't Mike. Not my Mike. The dimple was wrong. It wasn't the small, almost imperceptible indentation that appeared on Mike's left cheek when he smiled, but a deeper, unsettling crevice on his right. The tiny, almost invisible constellation of freckles that usually dusted the bridge of his nose were gone, erased by an uncanny smoothness of skin. And his eyes. Mike's eyes were a pale, almost crystalline blue, like ice on a winter morning. These, though the right shade, held a flat, lifeless quality, like cheap glass marbles. He was skinnier, too, his clothes hanging looser than they should. And the way his skin seemed stretched taut over his cheekbones, almost too pale, too perfect, sent a shiver straight down my spine. It was a wax figure, a cheap knockoff, meticulously crafted but fundamentally wrong. Like someone had tried to replicate a masterpiece from a pixelated photo, and the result was just an insult to the original. I don't know how long I stood there, paralyzed, just staring at this thing. My mind was a frantic scramble. Should I play along? Should I make a run for it? Scream? Punch it? My go bag felt like a lead weight on my shoulder. Every instinct screamed for flight, but something held me there, rooted to the spot. Maybe it was the morbid curiosity, that fatal flaw of mine. Or maybe it was the insidious pull of something that looked so much like the man I'd loved, a twisted promise of closure. "Leo, you don't look so good." The voice was Mike's, his inflections, his slight lilt, his breathy pause at the end of his name. But it was just a little too perfect, a mimicry, a parrot's echo. The sound snapped me out of my trance. "Huh? Oh, I haven't seen you since the breakup." I stammered, my voice barely a whisper. "I guess seeing you feels kind of unreal." Unreal was a gross understatement. It felt like standing on the edge of an abyss and peering into its unknowable depths. But a strange, desperate thought took root in my mind. What if I could find out what happened? What if this was my only chance to understand? And so, against every survival instinct I possessed, I decided to play along. This imposter, this mimicry, invited me to have coffee with him to discuss our breakup. Right now, I'm sitting in this cafe, a cup of lukewarm coffee growing cold in front of me, waiting for it to get back from the bathroom. I had already written the first part of this in a frantic, almost therapeutic haze beforehand. But now I'm writing the rest while I still can. My hands are shaking. You're probably thinking I'm crazy right now. I can already imagine the comments, the dismissive pats on the head. Grief is a powerful thing. Leo, you're just imagining things. Please, don't judge me. I need to know what happened to Mike. I miss him so much. I know, with every fiber of my being, that this thing isn't Mike, but it looks like him. It sounds like him. And maybe in my messed up, haunted world, that's enough. Maybe that's all I'll ever get. Character count, 9948. The fluorescent hum of the bowling alley bathroom was a lie. A buzzing, sickly sweet deception that tried, and failed, to mask the cosmic horror unfolding. My feet, or rather, where my feet should have been, dangled a foot above the grimy tile, useless as a pair of disconnected marionette strings. The man, no, the thing, stood before me, his face a mask of escalating fury. His eyes, those impossible black rectangles, stretched, warped, then hardened, pulling inward until they became twin, vertical slits, gleaming like polished obsidian. A viper's gaze, his voice, once a low, mocking rumble, now spit words with a venomous hiss, his perfect rock star lips distorting, revealing white, needle-sharp points where teeth should have been. "You are nothing," he'd snarled, each syllable a hammer blow against the fragile cage of my sanity. The air in the restroom, already thick with the scent of cheap disinfectant and stale sweat, suddenly tasted of ozone and something metallic, like old blood. This wasn't just a bad breakup. This was the universe tearing a fresh hole in its fabric. And I, as always, was standing directly in the tier. My old analog wristwatch, a nervous tick I couldn't shake even when levitating, felt like a dead weight against my skin, its hands spinning wildly in a dimension where time was a mere suggestion. That, of course, was how the evening peaked. The truly insane part, the part that would burrow into my skull and fester alongside all the other unexplainable horrors, was the moment I finally understood that I was a pawn in something truly ancient and impossibly vast. But to get to that particular slice of hell, you have to understand how I ended up in this bowling alley in the first place, with a girl I barely knew, feeling a pull I couldn't explain. I'd been working the graveyard shift at a distribution warehouse an hour out of town, a place so desolate it made the middle of nowhere feel like downtown Manhattan. It paid cash, and nobody asked too many questions. Perfect for a man like me, who preferred to be a ghost in the machine of society. My worn leather jacket, a second skin that had seen more highways and dive bars than I cared to count, hung on a hook by the door of my sparse motel room. The go bag was, as always, packed and ready, a silent promise of flight. I'd met Sarah a few weeks back, or rather, she'd found me. I was getting a lukewarm coffee from a truck stop, trying to scrape off the crust of another sleepless night, when she'd appeared, pale skin, dark hair, eyes that held a strange, ancient intelligence. Not my type. Usually, I preferred to blend, to be invisible. She was vibrant, too vibrant. She laughed, a sound like wind chimes in a mausoleum, and before I knew it, I was talking. About nothing. About everything, and for once, my usual guard, the one that screamed, "Run, Leo, run," whenever anyone got too close, just didn't. It was like a soft hum in the background, easily ignored. Maybe it was the exhaustion. Maybe it was the lingering, insidious chill from the last place. A whisper of a forgotten memory, a cold phantom clawing at the edges of my repressed past, leaving me vulnerable. Or maybe, and this thought clawed at the back of my mind even then, she was just really good at what she did. Tonight was our 1-year anniversary, a concept that felt utterly absurd. A year with me, the cynical voice in my head, the one that usually had dominion, was surprisingly quiet about this. We were at the Paradise Lanes, a name that felt like a bad joke. The place reeked of stale popcorn, synthetic cherry air freshener, and the ozone tang of old electrical equipment. It was mercifully empty, the kind of summer night where most sane people were anywhere but here. Sarah, dressed in a black top that swallowed the light and a pair of dark jeans, moved with an unsettling grace. She picked up a 16-pound ball, the heaviest they had, and with a casual flick of her wrist, sent it thundering down the lane. Crack, crash, clatter. Another strike. She spun around, her smile blinding. Innocent, almost childlike. Too innocent. My internal monologue, ever the critic, noted the impossible ease, the subtle flicker in her eyes. A kind of predatory amusement that was gone before I could truly register it. My hand went to my wrist, my thumb tracing the cold metal of the watch face. Just a nervous tick. Leo, nothing more. "I'll be back, babe." That Dr. Pepper went right through me. My voice was flat, even to my own ears. I didn't use endearments often. It felt unnatural, like trying on a costume that didn't quite fit. "Okay," she chirped, and I watched her saunter toward the concession counter, a tiny dark silhouette against the garish glow of the arcade games. She moved like a predator, even when buying hot dogs. The thought made my stomach clench. The men's room was a surprisingly clean oasis in the sea of sticky flooring. Not Buc-ee's clean, nothing was, but certainly not the usual biohazard I associated with public facilities. The air was thick with the generic, slightly floral scent of industrial cleaner. Empty, thankfully. I headed for the last urinal in the row of 5. The unwritten rule of urinal etiquette being a comfort in its simple, predictable logic. Give a man his space. Give me my space. I sighed, a long, weary exhalation as I unzipped, letting the day's artificial sweetness drain away. It was then that I felt it more than heard it. A presence, a distinct, cold pressure that settled in the air beside me. No footsteps, no creak of the door, just there. My bladder suddenly felt like it was playing a drum solo against my ribs. I glanced over. A cardinal sin of urinal etiquette, but one that my hypervigilant survival instincts insisted upon. He looked like a bad boy rock star from a faded magazine cover. Sharp, dark sunglasses obscured his eyes, but couldn't hide the taut, angled jawline, the high cheekbones, or the unnaturally pale skin, paler even than Sarah's. Black lipstick, a stark slash against his pallor, matched the shoulder-length black hair that framed his face. He was thin, almost skeletal, an inch taller than me, and I could see the sharp protrusion of his collarbone beneath a plain white t-shirt, itself mostly hidden by a black leather jacket. A single, simple silver cross, utterly out of place, hung from a thin chain, resting flat against his sternum, a bizarre ensemble. My observational skills, honed by too many close calls, immediately registered the subtle wrongness, the unsettling perfection that screamed, "This isn't real." "Nice equipment. I see why she likes you." The voice was a low, resonant rumble, surprisingly calm. He hadn't turned his head. His eyes, hidden behind the dark lenses, were fixed straight ahead, presumably at the wall. My skin crawled. The casual intimacy of the comment, the sheer audacity of it, was unsettling. I zipped up, far too quickly for comfort. "Ah, you must be the ex I've heard so much about," I said, trying to inject some of my usual world-weary sarcasm into my voice. But it came out flat. My eyes, too, remained fixed forward, locked onto the chipped tile grout in front of me. The sheer frailty of his frame, the almost delicate bones, gave me a sliver of false confidence. Just a goth kid with boundary issues. "Leo, you've faced worse. Probably." "Ex?" He paused. Then a thin, sharp smile split his lips. "We're just on a break." The word break hung in the air, loaded with a meaning I couldn't quite grasp, but that sent a chill down my spine. I didn't respond. Sarah had explicitly told me not to engage, that he was trouble. My fatal flaw, that damn reluctant conscience, usually got me into trouble by trying to help people. Here, it was almost tempting to ignore her, to push back, but for once, self-preservation won out. I hit the urinal's handle, the rushing water a welcome, mundane sound, and walked deliberately towards the sink. My movements were slow, measured, almost theatrical. I knew, with a perverse satisfaction, that this calm, indifferent display would annoy him far more than any verbal jab, and a small, twisted part of me relished that. I washed my hand slowly, methodically, scrubbing even the back of my knuckles, watching him in the periphery. As I turned the faucet off and straightened up, my eyes met his in the mirror. His face was directly over my shoulder, too close. His glasses twitched, almost imperceptibly, before settling back into place. His nose flared. He was irritated. Good. A blatant smirk, a flicker of my own cynical defiance, touched my lips in the reflection. I grabbed a handful of paper towels, crumpled them. As I turned, wiping my hands, I saw his gaze drop briefly to my hands, then to my face. A mirroring smile, sharp and knowing, bloomed on his lips. "You're cocky." "I dig that," he said, his voice still a low purr. "So does Sarah." I couldn't help myself. The words were out before I could censor them. A stupid, juvenile taunt. My reluctant conscience clearly had a day off, replaced by the part of me that just wanted to poke the bear. His head tilted, a slow, deliberate movement to the left. A loud, sickening crack echoed through the quiet restroom as his neck vertebrae realigned. His mouth elongated, thinning, as if searching for a response to my jab. Both hands rose, fingers long and pale to the rims of his shades. He was taking them off. This was it. "Kid," he began, his voice dropping, taking on a new, dangerous edge. "Me and her go back a long way, much longer than you think. You're not going to be with her long. You are simply a phase, something she does for fun, to feel normal. But make no mistake." His face slid forward, uncomfortably close to mine, until his nose was centimeters from my own. I could feel the faint, unnatural chill radiating from his skin. The air around us seemed to thicken, to hum with an unseen energy. His irises, I saw now, were not merely hidden by the dark lenses. They were flattened, two long, horizontal ovals. As he spoke, the edges hardened, solidified, becoming perfect. Obsidian black rectangles. My breath hitched. This was not a trick of the light. This was not context. "You are nothing." He spoke the words with sharp, deliberate rhythm, each one a separate, precise pronouncement. My mind, scrambling for a defense, for a familiar footing in a rapidly dissolving reality, latched onto the most mundane thing I could think of. "Nice contacts, weirdo," I quipped, though my voice was tighter than I intended. "No wonder Sarah dumped your weird ass." It was a mistake, a big one. I turned my back, heading for the door, my heart hammering against my ribs, convinced I'd pushed him too far. A long-fingered palm, impossibly cold, struck my chest, flat and firm, stopping me mid-stride. I looked up, open alarm now painting my face, as he stood directly in front of me again, blocking my exit. He was smiling, the same thin, cruel smile. I glanced over my shoulder, a frantic, desperate check, praying for a trick of perspective, a twin, anything. No one. The restroom was still empty save for us. My head slowly, mechanically, turned back to him. "She'll be pissed at you if we fight," I stammered, the words suddenly tasting like ash. My bravado had evaporated like mist in a summer sun. "Fight?" he sputtered, a high-pitched, almost disbelieving sound, like someone trying to mimic human emotion. "Kid, I like you, but you really overestimate yourself." Then, my world shifted. My body floated, not like falling, but like being gently, irresistibly lifted. His palm remained flat against my chest, a cold anchor. All my limbs froze, useless. I could turn my head. I could see. I could even speak. But no sound came out. A distinct, undeniable dread, thick and cloying, filled every inch of me, settling deep in my bones. He noticed it. His smile widened. "See, kid," he said, his voice now lower, almost a whisper, as he finally pulled his hand back. But I continued to levitate, tethered to some invisible force, bobbing gently in the stale air. "We go back a long time. We are bound by blood. She called me. We are destined to be together. Always." Then, it happened. The cool, calm demeanor, the veneer of a bored rock star, shattered. His head began to tremble, a fine vibration that shook his entire impossibly thin frame. His limbs twitched, hands clenching and unclenching into agitated fists. He began to pace back and forth, a restless predator in a cage, no longer looking at me, but seemingly having a furious conversation with himself. Then she has to get all sentimental about a childhood she never got to have, and we do this shit again. He raised his fingers for air quotes, mimicking a voice that was clearly Sarah's, though laced with a sneering contempt. "Sure, it's great you animals came up with medications that help her. I'll grant you monkeys that, but all this sentimental nonsense about childhood memories and living life, whatever that's supposed to mean." My mind still struggling to process the levitation, the eyes, the impossible cold, latched onto one phrase. "What the hell are you?" I finally managed to spit out, my voice a ragged croak. He paused, mid-stride, as if suddenly remembering I was there, hovering a foot away, witness to his insane monologue. That sharp smile returned, but now it was a rictus of pure, malicious glee. The white tips of his teeth, impossibly elongated and interlaced, gleamed in the dim light. His rectangle irises slowly, sickeningly, turned vertical, twin black slits pulling taut. The eyes of a snake, or something far, far worse. He leaned in again, his breath, surprisingly, odorless, but carrying a preternatural chill. Every couple hundred years, she gets this wild hair on her ass, uses some brat like you to give her a fake, imitated experience. You're a toy kid, so watch that attitude of yours. His anger in his voice rose, echoing off the tiled walls, seeming to vibrate through my levitating body. I swear, he spoke, spittle, glinting wetly, flung from his lips in rage. The only reason I haven't wiped your miserable race out is because of her. I love her. You don't even know her. His nostrils flared out, taking in a long, deep breath. The anger, as quickly as it had surged, receded, and a chilling calm reclaimed him. I saw his pupils begin dilating again, returning to a more human shape. But he closed them before I could see what truly horrible forms they'd assume. He returned his sunglasses to the bridge of his nose, the dark lenses once again obscuring the true horror beneath. Instantly, my weight returned. My feet slammed back to the ground, jarring my knees. I stumbled, catching myself on two wobbly legs. The air, though still thick with the lingering weirdness, felt less suffocating. I paused, trembling, trying to pull myself together, to make sense of the impossible. My head spun. My hand, automatically, went to my wristwatch, my thumb tracing the numbers, a desperate need for something solid, something real. That's when I saw her. Sarah stood framed in the bathroom doorway, her face a mask of furious concentration. She was fuming. Her dark eyes, usually so captivating, now glittered with an unsettling, almost predatory light. "AC!" she screamed, her voice cutting through the lingering tension like a whip. "I told you to leave him alone. We were just having a chat, babe," he purred, his voice back to its initial, unsettling calm. "I'm not your babe," she snapped, the words resonating with a power I hadn't heard from her before. The force of her voice made the fluorescent lights flicker. The rest of their argument became a distant hum to me, muffled, as if I was submerged underwater. My mind felt disconnected, floating somewhere above the grotesque spectacle. Mysteries and horrors of the universe unveiled in a dingy bowling alley bathroom. I felt like an alien observer, a tourist in a world I did not belong, privy to a conversation between beings far beyond my comprehension. He looked over his shoulder at me, a fleeting frown creasing his brow, his eyes still masked by the darkened lenses. "Gah, I should have wiped you out the day you invented Twitter," he spat, the contempt in his voice so thick it was almost palpable. "Just go away," Sarah spoke, arms crossed over her chest, her stance defiant, regal. "Not how you felt during Convocatio," he said, his voice now tinged with what sounded like genuine hurt, a flicker of something almost human in his tone. "The opposite, in fact." "That was different," she muttered, her eyes flicking, almost imperceptibly, towards me. A flicker of something in her gaze, something that wasn't innocence, that spoke of ancient pacts and cold, cosmic choices. "So were you, Sarah Good. So were you," AC said, his form blurring for a moment at the edges, before he simply wasn't there anymore. Gone. The heavy stillness he left behind was almost worse than his presence. Weirdly enough, a perverse, cynical part of me, the part that usually reserved its pity for myself, felt a pang of something. Pity? For the actual demon? This was a new low. The silence that followed his departure was heavy, suffocating. Sarah stood there, staring at the empty doorway, her anger slowly leaching away, replaced by an unsettling blankness. My hands were still trembling. The smell of ozone still lingered. I need some time to process what happened. I managed to stammer, my voice thin and reedy. There was too much I didn't understand, too much that didn't fit. The one-year anniversary now felt like a sick joke. When I asked her about it, about him, about her, she just shook her head. Her face, usually so expressive, was a closed book. "I don't want to talk about it," she said, her voice flat, devoid of the charming lilt I'd somehow been suckered by. It hit me then, a cold, hard truth. I didn't know her at all. And worse, the strange, inexplicable pull I'd felt towards her, the one that had quieted my usual alarms, had vanished, replaced by a deep-seated revulsion. The whole thing felt off, like she was a disguise, and the person beneath had just peeled back the edges for a moment. My reluctant conscience, the one that usually made me stick around, was screaming at me to run faster and further than I ever had before. I spent the next few hours in my motel room, the heavy mag light from my go bag clutched in my hand, staring at the worn leather jacket hanging on the door. Every shadow seemed to writhe. Every creak of the old building sent a jolt of fear through me. My mind replayed the scene in the bathroom, over and over. The eyes, the levitation, the casual way they spoke of centuries. And then Sarah, the silence, the refusal to explain. I wanted to leave, needed to leave. The road was my only constant, my only refuge. But a new insidious fear had rooted itself. What if he found me if I kept seeing her? More terrifying, what if he found me if I didn't? What if I was now marked simply for being a toy? My hands went to my wrist again, turning the watch's crown, the mechanical click a tiny, reassuring sound in the chaos of my thoughts. Another layer of trauma, another reason to keep moving, faster, further. The weight of the world and all its unseen horrors seemed to settle heavier on my shoulders. God, I hated my fatal flaw. The ceramic shards of what had been, moments ago, a living, featureless infant, lay scattered on the stained tile floor. A flash of lightning, a sudden, blinding crack from the storm raging outside, had ripped through the grime-streaked window, momentarily illuminating the grotesque still life. My own reflection stared back from the slick, wet tiles, eyes wide, jaw slack, a silent scream clawing at the back of my throat. The sickeningly sweet smell, a cloying, putrid perfume of something fundamentally wrong, clung to the air, making my stomach churn again. I could still feel the impossible, fleshy weight of it in my hands, a warmth that had pulsed with an alien life. Before the shock, the sheer, bone-deep, sanity-shredding horror had made my fingers lose their grip. 1 minute, I was wrestling with the mundane horrors of a fast food toilet. The next, I was looking at something that defied every law of nature, every shred of sanity I had desperately clung to. How did I get here? Another stupid question. The answer was always the same, one foot in front of the other, always shuffling towards the next disaster. It started with a shift like any other, a fresh dose of soul-crushing monotony at a place that rhymed with murder wing. Another Tuesday night, another 8 hours of my life hemorrhaging into the stale, grease-laden air of a fast food purgatory. The air was thick enough to chew, a greasy, cloying miasma of stale fryer oil, cheap cleaning chemicals, and the faint, unsettling scent of desperation. My worn leather jacket, a permanent fixture that felt more like a second skin than mere clothing, was slung over the back of a sticky booth, a small island of personal space in a sea of corporate-mandated beige and plastic. I preferred the night shift. Fewer faces, fewer demands, just the rhythmic hum of the chillers and the occasional clang of a dropped basket in the kitchen. It allowed for a certain kind of anonymity, a bleak comfort in being a ghost haunting the edges of a flickering neon world. My analog wristwatch, its leather strap softened and cracked from years of nervous fiddling, felt heavy on my wrist. I checked it, not for the time. What was time to a man perpetually running from it? But as a familiar, grounding tick, a quiet click against the ever-present hum of the Friars. My current occupation, a glorified cashier and occasional mop jockey, was just another transient gig in a long line of them. Truck driver, warehouse night shift, security guard for places that didn't mind a quiet, watchful presence. Anything to keep moving, to keep the wolf of my past, the beast that gnawed at the edges of my memory, at bay. The constant motion was a balm, a dull ache that eclipsed the deeper, sharper pain of what I'd lost, of what had happened. Sycamore Grove. The name echoed in the hollow spaces where my earliest memories should have been, a phantom limb of a trauma I couldn't quite touch, but which certainly touched me. It was why I was here, why I was always here, drawn to the underbelly of things, a magnet for the horrific, the regular shift workers, the ones with mortgages and dreams and kids they actually wanted, always looked at me with a mix of pity and suspicion. I didn't care. I didn't want their pity, and their suspicion was justified. They had no idea the kind of things I'd seen, the dark currents that pulled me, reluctantly, into situations no sane person would touch. My cynicism was a shield, thick and dented from countless impacts. It kept the world out and the screaming in. The restaurant was slowly dying down, a few stragglers picking at their congealed fries, bathed in the sickly yellow glow of the overhead lights. That's when they walked in. A couple, at first glance, utterly unremarkable. The guy, maybe early 20s, had the kind of pasty, unexercised look of someone whose primary relationship was with a screen. Greasy brown hair, a few acne scars, and the blotchy white arms of a Games Workshop enthusiast peeking out from under a Bazinga t-shirt. My internal monologue, ever helpful, immediately supplied a snide remark about his chosen uniform, a monument to arrested development. Then there was her. She was almost an antithesis to him, tall, lean, with a mane of dark amber hair that seemed to absorb the dim light, throwing off sparks of color. She wore a thin maroon dress, a flimsy excuse for clothing that clung to her body in a way that left little to the imagination. Her legs, sheathed in knee-high boots, seemed impossibly long, silken smooth. Her face, I noticed with the kind of hyper-observational detail that had kept me alive on more than one occasion, was perfectly symmetrical, save for a scattering of freckles that were almost, but not quite, hidden by a meticulous application of makeup. No man, I thought, was looking at her face. And by the way she moved, a predatory glide rather than a walk, you just knew. This was not a woman who stumbled into places by accident. They ordered a generic combo meal for him, just a soda for her, as if she fed on something other than French fries. I took their money, my hand brushing his clammy fingers, an immediate aversion coiling in my gut. My internal dialogue, usually so verbose, was strangely quiet. There was something off. It wasn't just the incongruity of them as a pair, the way her predatory grace contrasted with his slouched, apologetic posture. It was a subtle wrongness, like a painting hung slightly askew, or a note played just off-key. It prickled at the edges of my perception, the same way a change in air pressure warns of an approaching storm. Or, worse, the way a sudden silence can precede a scream. They took their tray, shuffled past me, and headed for the back. Not to the booths, not to the tables, straight towards the restroom corridor. My jaw tightened. Of course, the pseudo-exhibitionists. I'd seen them all. Straight, gay, threesomes, old, young, way too old. People who got off on the mild danger, the public accessibility of doing it in a place designed for bowel movements. They'd emerge later, usually with a self-satisfied smirk, a shared glance, ruffled clothes, and hair that looked like they just survived a small hurricane. Part of me, the world-weary, cynical part, just shrugged. People were animals. Always had been, always would be. Another part, the reluctant conscience I cursed daily, twitched. Should I say something? Stop them? Then I remembered Lucy, my manager. Lucy, with her bangled arms and her permanent scowl, her hair pulled back so tight it looked like she'd had a recent facelift. The same Lucy who'd fired a junior staff member a couple of months ago for trying to prevent a similar bathroom rendezvous. Didn't want to clean up their AIDS-ridden condoms, the poor kid had apparently blurted out. Lucy had fired him on the spot, said it gave the place a bad reputation. Customer was always right, even when the customer was a biohazard. I grunted. Not my circus, not my monkeys. Besides, I was off in 3 hours. Just make it to the bell. Leo, that's all you ever do. The next 3 hours dragged like a corpse through gravel. The fluorescent lights hummed, the fryers bubbled, and the greasy smells intensified. I watched the clock, the minute hand crawling, each tick an eternity. Outside, the sky had begun to darken, a bruised purple bruise turning to angry black. Thunder rumbled, a low growl that shook the cheap plate glass. A storm was brewing, a real gully washer, by the sound of it. My only thought was to get out, get into my beat-up car, and disappear down the highway before the heavens opened up. Just as I was about to hang up my apron, the flimsy polyester uniform a weight on my shoulders, a voice sliced through the drone of the kitchen. "Oh, Darren!" The high, nasal whine belonged to Lucy. My stomach clenched. Darren. She still called me that, despite me correcting her half a dozen times. She couldn't be bothered to remember. Or maybe she just enjoyed the little power trip. Whatever. I was done. "Yeah, Lucy," I tried to keep my voice even, but a thread of fatigue and irritation probably bled through. I walked towards her tiny office, a claustrophobic cubicle reeking of cheap air freshener and stale coffee. On the wall, above a stack of disorganized paperwork, hung a poster that was a constant irritant. A cartoon character, a little girl from the Peanut strip saying, "Thought for the day, start each morning with a smile and get it over with." God, I hated that poster. The fake optimism, the passive aggression. It was everything I despised about corporate culture, wrapped up in a saccharine bow. Lucy didn't even look up from her paperwork. Her bangles clinked as she gestured vaguely with a pen. "Allie isn't in today. Needs you to cover her jobs before you go home." "Are you kidding me?" I muttered, leaning against the doorframe, trying to keep my voice down. Allie was notoriously flaky, always sick, or pregnant, or celebrating some obscure holiday that only she seemed to observe. And because of it, Lucy piled all the crappy, unpleasant jobs onto her. I glanced at the rota. My blood ran cold. Toilet cleanup. "Ah, Lucy, you gotta be shitting me," I said, unable to keep the disgust out of my voice. "Can't you just fire Allie already? She's clearly taking advantage." She finally looked up, her expression unchanging, a mask of managerial indifference. Her black curls, tight and lacquered, didn't even seem to move. "Not my decision, honey. Not your decision, but you're the manager. You're the one who fired that kid for having a conscience." My voice was rising now, fueled by exhaustion and the unfairness of it all. "Fire her ass. She's costing you money, and she's making everyone else's life hell." Lucy's eyes narrowed. "You best watch yourself. Darren, don't go starting shit where there doesn't need to be any. Okay? Just go grab the bleach and wash the toilets like a good little boy." Her voice was deceptively soft, but the threat was clear. "Fuck you," I whispered under my breath, turning on my heel before she could hear me. In my mind's eye, I saw myself tearing the lid off a gallon of industrial-strength bleach and pouring it down her throat, past those unnervingly white teeth. Instead, I just stomped out of the office, grabbed the little red mop trolley. its wheels squeaking a pathetic protest, and pushed it towards the bathrooms. Another Tuesday night, another thankless, disgusting task. Just another brick in the wall of my personal hell. People always assumed the women's toilets were cleaner. They were always wrong. The sheer volume of used tampons, soiled sanitary towels, and, inexplicably, discarded underwear I'd encountered over the years had long since disabused me of any such notion. At least, in the women's, they generally managed to hit the bowl when they peed. Mostly, I didn't spend long in there. Mercifully, they were in a relatively decent state tonight, save for a couple of unflushed gifts. My stomach churned, but I shoved it down. I was a professional. After all, a professional cleaner of other people's biological waste. What a life. I rolled the trolley into the male toilets, the smell hitting me immediately. A potent cocktail of stale urine, cheap air freshener, and something vaguely metallic. I did a routine sweep, checking the stalls, mentally preparing for whatever vile surprise awaited me. And that's when I noticed it. One of the stalls was locked. My mind, accustomed to the immediate jump to the worst-case scenario, went there instantly. The couple, they hadn't left. I hadn't seen them. Had they somehow overdosed on something? Poppers? Narcotics? My reluctant conscience, the one I hated with a passion, pricked at me. I should just leave, lock the door, call the manager, and walk away. But no, the image of the pale, flabby kid and the strikingly beautiful woman. Something about them had been wrong, still was. I pressed my ear against the cheap particle board door, listening, not for moans or curses, though I half expected them, for anything. Hushed whispers, a cough, the rustle of clothing. But there was nothing. Absolute silence. A deep, unsettling silence that swallowed the ambient hum of the restaurant, the distant rumble of thunder. A silence that felt too heavy, too complete, for a small enclosed space with two people inside. It was the kind of silence that made the hairs on my arms stand on end. A primal warning, like the silence that had fallen over Sycamore Grove just before the fire. Before the screaming started, panic, cold and sharp, began to prickle at my skin. Not the usual, oh God, I'm going to find a used condom panic. This was something else, a deeper, more fundamental dread. I imagined them slumped inside, eyes wide and unseeing, victims of their own hedonism. Or worse, I had to see, I had to know. I stepped onto the neighboring toilet seat, my hands bracing against the tiled wall. The porcelain was cold, unyielding. As I strained to get a look over the top of the stall, my foot slipped. My old, worn boot plunged into the murky water of the bowl, the toe instantly soaked with cold, stale urine. God damn it, I swore, a low, guttural curse snatching my foot back. The disgust was immediate, visceral. I scrambled back onto the rim, carefully balancing, ignoring the growing discomfort of the wet sock. Every nerve ending was screaming. And then I saw them. The man lay on top of the woman, still entwined, still inside her, or what remained of them. The Bazinga shirt was gone, discarded, but that was the least of it. His skin was the color of death, a mottled gray-green hue, like something dragged from a swamp and left to rot. Her caramel skin had merely paled, but it was just as chilling. One of her legs, stark naked, stuck out from under his corpse, and on her ankle, stark against her paled flesh, was a tattoo, a skull. Appropriately enough, they smelled sickeningly sweet, a cloying, heavy scent that reminded me of meat left out too long in the sun, fermenting. It was the smell of decay, but infused with something else, something cloying and unnatural. It was the smell of wrongness. My stomach heaved. The vomit surged up my throat, bile burning. I didn't even try to hold it back. I stumbled off the toilet, turning my face to the bowl I'd just stepped in, ignoring the stink of stale piss as I hurled my guts out. What the hell had I just seen? The speed of it, from a normal, if slightly unhinged, couple to this, in a few hours. The impossibility of it hammered at my skull, without thinking, driven by a desperate, nauseating need for answers. For reason, I staggered around to the cubicle door. I started hammering, my shoulders slamming against the cheap, plastic-coated wood. Pain flared, a dull throb in my shoulder, but I ignored it. If what I had just seen was real, I needed to help them, or, failing that, get them the hell out of here. Even in my adrenaline-fueled haze, a corner of my mind screamed how ludicrous it was. I'd expected a condom or two, not this. Entangled bodies, rotting before my eyes. "Open up," I shouted, my voice raw. "Open the goddamn door!" With one last, desperate shove, the flimsy lock snapped, the cheap plastic groaning in protest before giving way. The door swung inward with a violent clang, the plastic-coated wood striking the tiled wall with a resounding crash. I threw my hand out, expecting to land on the man's naked, greasy back, to brace myself against the weight of the decaying bodies. But my hand found nothing. Air. Empty. Cold air. My momentum carried me forward, through the space where the bodies should have been, and I tripped, coming down hard on the grimy tile floor. My head spun. Had I imagined it? The locked door, the corpses, the couple entirely. Was I finally losing it? Was this the breaking point? The ultimate gift from Sycamore Grove? Then the door swung shut again, the flimsy lock hanging uselessly, a broken tooth and a shattered smile. And there, hanging on the coat hook inside the stall, were the man's clothes, his bazinga, t-shirt, his jeans, his shoes, and the maroon dress, all of them, as if they had simply stepped out of them and vanished. The clothes were real. The bodies hadn't been. My mind reeled, trying to reconcile the impossibility. My hands trembled as I pushed myself up from the floor, my eyes darting around the empty, silent stall. That's when I heard it, a soft, wet mewling sound coming from the toilet bowl itself. Barely believing anything by that point, already existing in a dreamlike, detached state, I staggered towards the toilet, and there it was, blocking the U-bend, a huge, floating ball of hair. The woman's dark amber strands were interwoven with the man's greasy brown hairs, a grotesque, impossible parody of their earlier coupling. It floated there, dense and horrifying, like a drowned rodent. A shiver raked through me, a cold claw gripping my spine. Despite the disgust, a morbid curiosity, the same fatal flaw that always drew me into danger, compelled me. I reached into the bowl, my hand sinking into the cold, fetid water. The hairball was surprisingly heavy, a viscous, soaking mass. I lifted it out, water streaming from it, the intermingled strands slimy between my fingers. I held it carefully, like something precious and terrifying. The mewling sound intensified, a faint, wet cry coming from within the mass. Outside, the storm had hit in full force. The rain drummed on the plastic bins and the flimsy roof with an almost deafening roar, a frantic, hammering symphony. But it all seemed a world away. All that mattered, all that held my gaze, was the wet, dripping ball of human hair in my hands. My fingers, strangely numb, began to peel away layer after layer of the sodden, matted strands. It was like unwrapping a disgusting, organic parcel. Sheets of wet human hair sloughed off, falling onto the dirty tile floor around my feet, creating a grotesque, sticky carpet. The mewling grew stronger, more insistent, a soft, pathetic sound. I kept peeling, driven by an awful fascination, by the sheer, unholy wrongness of it all. As the outer layers gave way, the parcel began to take form, shifting, almost pulsating, in my hands. Finally, I was left alone, holding it, a featureless, living baby. It was fleshy, like a wet, pinkish-gray blob of clay, with no discernible features, no eyes, no nose, no mouth, just smooth, soft skin that was unnervingly warm. But it was alive. It mewled again, a tiny, breathy sound, and I felt a faint pulse against my palm. My breath hitched in my throat. This wasn't human. It wasn't anything I knew. It was an aberration, a physical manifestation of the horror I had just witnessed. Another flash of lightning, brighter and closer this time, ripped through the air, followed immediately by a deafening clap of thunder that rattled the cheap walls. The sudden, intense light, the violent noise, jolted me out of my detached reverie. Reality, sharp and brutal, slammed into me. This was real. This was happening. My mind, overloaded, simply broke. In my shock, my fingers spasmed, and the thing in my hand slipped. It hit the dirty tile floor with a sickening, wet crack. Despite its fleshy consistency, the child didn't splatter. It broke apart, like a porcelain doll, into several distinct shards. A large, featureless head, a torso, a couple of limbs. Each piece lay there, pristine in its brokenness, glowing faintly in the dim light. The sickeningly sweet smell intensified, a thick, cloying miasma that filled my lungs and made me gag. I don't know how long I just sat there on the toilet, hunched over, weeping, dry, racking sobs that tore at my throat. The storm raged outside, mirroring the chaos within me. My mind tried to put the pieces together, not just the physical ones on the floor, but the impossible, shattered pieces of my own sanity. A couple, sex, locked door, no bodies, hairball, living baby, shattered flesh. It defied logic. It defied everything. It was the kind of impossible horror that confirmed my deepest fear, that the world was not just indifferent, but actively, malevolently hostile, that I was marked, and this was just another stop on my personal tour of hell, another layer of trauma, meticulously added to the cursed architecture of my life, a new scar on top of the old, unhealing ones from Sycamore Grove. Eventually, the tears stopped. The well ran dry. I was left with a cold, hollow ache. My mind, numbed by the sheer impossibility of it, slipped back into that detached, dreamlike state. I did what any sane man, pushed past the breaking point, would do. I swept up the shards of whatever the fuck that was, using a stiff piece of cardboard I found behind the toilet. I gathered the wet hair, the discarded clothes from the hook, surprisingly, no female underwear, a final, unsettling detail in a nightmare of details, and crammed it all into the toilet bowl. Then, I flushed, again, and again, and again, until the churning water finally, mercifully, swallowed the last piece, dragging it down into the dark pipes, erasing it from my sight, if not from my mind. I walked out of the male toilets, leaving the red mop trolley where it stood. I didn't bother clocking out. I walked straight to Lucy's office. She was still hunched over her paperwork, her bangles clinking softly. I didn't even knock. She looked up, annoyed. "I quit," I said, my voice flat, devoid of emotion. She scoffed. "You can't just quit. Darren, you've got duties to—" "I quit." My voice was still flat, but there was an underlying tremor, a low hum of violence. My eyes, I knew, were probably wild. "I'm done. I'm out." She must have seen something in my face, something beyond mere defiance. The mask of managerial indifference cracked. She sat up straight, a flicker of genuine fear in her eyes. All right, get out." I turned and walked away, not bothering to retrieve my jacket, the uniform, the place, the memory of it all. I wanted to burn it clean from my skin. I stepped out into the raging storm, the rain lashing down, washing over my face like cleansing tears. It didn't help. Nothing ever did. Another transient job, another city in the rearview mirror, another horror added to the chronicle of my unwanted existence, running from the past, running towards the next thing. This wasn't just a job I'd quit. It was another confirmation that the world was broken, and I was cursed to walk among its shattered pieces. And somewhere, out there, the things that were drawn to me, the things that were part of me, were waiting. Always waiting. Total character count, 9876. The scrape of metal on wood was a sound that would forever live in the cold, damp corners of my memory. It wasn't just a doorknob turning, it was a frantic, desperate jiggling, punctuated by the soft, rhythmic thump, thump, thump of something impossibly heavy shifting its weight on the floorboards directly above my head. The air in the downstairs living room had grown thick with a cold that had nothing to do with the thermostat and everything to do with primal dread. My breath hitched, a dry, ragged gasp caught in my throat, and I could feel the cheap, floral pattern of the sofa digging into my back. A stark, unwelcome reality beneath a nightmare. Every instinct screamed at me to bolt, to vanish into the night, but my feet were lead, my muscles locked as the scraping escalated. A metallic shriek that promised imminent splintering, a grotesque key trying to force an impossible lock. That moment, however, wasn't born out of thin air. It was the chilling crescendo to a night that had begun with nothing more than an ill-advised venture into the quiet, deceptively mundane Virginia woods, a place where the shadows held more than just deer, and the silence hummed with a hunger I'd felt before, a hunger that had always, somehow, found me. The sun had been a red smear on the horizon, bleeding into the bruised purple of dusk when I'd pulled my beat-up 98 pickup into the driveway of the house. Another short-term gig, another anonymous address in a suburban sprawl, another set of keys handed over by a real estate agent who looked like she chewed glass for breakfast. This one was a foreclosure, a two-story box on the edge of a development, just across the freeway from a sprawling patch of woods. My kind of place, usually quiet, isolated, minimal human interaction. The kind of place I could fade into for a few weeks, earn a few bucks, then be gone before anyone remembered my face. I'd been hired to keep an eye on it, make sure no squatters or vandals took up residence while the bank argued with itself. It paid cash, which meant no paper trail, no questions asked. Perfect. I'd tossed my worn leather jacket onto the back of the sofa, the familiar weight a small comfort in the unfamiliar quiet of the empty house. My go bag was already by the door, a heavy mag light and a spare set of clothes ready for a quick exit. Because you never knew. My analog wristwatch, a relic I clung to like a drowning man to a life raft, caught the last sliver of fading light from the window. 6:30, plenty of time to get a feel for the place before the real darkness set in. The house itself was nothing special. Generic beige walls, cheap carpeting, and the lingering scent of stale air freshener trying to mask something deeper, something indefinable. I'd walk through it, checking windows, testing locks, listening to the creak of the empty floorboards beneath my boots. Up on the second floor, a small office at the front of the house, directly above the living room, was locked tight. The agent had said it was full of old junk the previous owners hadn't bothered to take. Just leave it be, she chirped. Bank doesn't care. Sounded good to me. As night deepened, a strange, almost imperceptible hum started to vibrate in the air. Not a physical sound, more like a low-frequency pressure against my eardrums. It put me on edge, made the hairs on my forearms prickle. Probably just the freeway, I told myself. A constant thrumming artery of concrete and steel, but it felt different, more localized. I found a pair of night vision binoculars tucked away in a dusty closet, probably left behind by the previous, suddenly departed, occupants, old military issue, clunky but powerful. My curiosity, that damn reluctant conscience of mine, began to itch. I usually suppressed it, But sometimes a vague wrongness in the air was too loud to ignore. It was the same feeling that had pulled me into other messes. The same insidious whisper that started fires, that made me look when I should have been looking away. It was the siren song of the Sycamore Grove incident, still echoing in the deep, unacknowledged caverns of my mind, reminding me of what I'd lost, what I hadn't saved, against my better judgment. And believe me, my judgment usually screams run. I decided to take a stroll, not because I was brave, but because the hum was getting louder, pressing against the inside of my skull, and I needed to put a face to it, or at least a location. Maybe it was just a local substation, a power line, something mundane, but my gut, a well-calibrated compass for disaster, told me otherwise. I slipped on my jacket, grabbed the night vision binoculars, and stepped out into the oppressive darkness. The air outside was thick and still, carrying the faint, metallic tang of the distant freeway exhaust. I crossed the street, the worn asphalt crunching under my boots, and passed under the echoing, concrete maw of the freeway overpass. The sound of distant traffic faded behind me, replaced by the rustle of unseen leaves and the faint, earthy scent of damp soil and decaying wood. The trees loomed, dark and indistinct, a wall of silent sentinels. I plunged into them, the beam of my mag light cutting a tunnel through the oppressive blackness, the night vision binoculars slung around my neck. 5 minutes in, the woods began to feel less like a nature trail and more like a primordial tomb. The trees grew denser, their branches intertwined overhead, swallowing what little starlight might have penetrated. The air grew noticeably colder, a sharp, unseasonal chill that sank into my bones, raising goosebumps despite the relative warmth of my jacket. I stopped by a gnarled oak, its roots like arthritic knuckles clutching the earth, and brought the binoculars up to my eyes. The world swam into an eerie green. The leaves became a shimmering tapestry, the tree trunks stark, skeletal fingers against a monochrome sky. I scanned, slowly, methodically, my eyes searching for any movement, any anomaly. Squirrels. Yes, small blurs of gray scurrying across the ground. A pair of glowing eyes, too small for a deer, probably an opossum, blinked back from a low branch before vanishing. Nothing out of the ordinary, just the usual nocturnal residents. My cynical brain was already formulating the internal monologue. Great, Leo. Another wild goose chase. You're just jumpy, old age, or too much instant coffee. I started to lower the binoculars, a sigh of weary relief half forming on my lips, when something caught my eye. 50 feet to my left, partially obscured by the trunk of a massive pine, something was watching. I froze, the binoculars pressed firmly to my face. My breath held. I tried to focus, to resolve the green-tinged blur into something identifiable. It wasn't a bear, it wasn't a deer. It was too tall, too thin, and utterly, terrifyingly still. As my eyes adjusted, a sickening wave of recognition, of wrongness, washed over me. It looked like a man, but not quite. Gaunt, impossibly emaciated. Its skin seemed to glow with a sickly pallor in the green light of the night vision. Its head was bald, smooth and unnaturally elongated, and its eyes, even through the monochrome lens, seemed to bore into me with an intensity that made the hair on my neck stand on end. It was standing almost perfectly flat against the tree, as if trying to blend into its bark. But its posture was all wrong, a predatory stillness that screamed, "Hunter." It wasn't hiding, it was waiting, and it was looking directly at me. My heart hammered against my ribs, a frantic drum against the silence of the woods. No, not again. This isn't happening. I'd seen things before, things that defied logic, things that clawed at the edges of sanity. But this was raw, primal, a hunger made manifest. The air around me seemed to grow heavier, pressing down, stifling. I wanted to move, to run, but my muscles had locked. caught in the grip of pure, unadulterated terror. The thing didn't move, not a twitch, not a blink, just those eyes, burning into me from the shadowed depths of the forest. A low growl, a sound like gravel churning in a starved throat, emanated from the woods. It wasn't loud, but it was deep, resonating in my chest cavity. That was my cue. Every fiber of my being screamed for me to put distance between myself and whatever that was. I forced my leaden feet to move, slowly at first, then picking up speed. I didn't run wildly. Not yet. Years of running had taught me the value of a controlled retreat. I kept my head on a swivel, the binoculars still pressed to my eyes, scanning the trees, making sure it wasn't circling, wasn't flanking. It didn't follow, not openly, anyway. The silence behind me was more terrifying than any pursuit. It was the silence of a predator who knew it had all the time in the world, who knew its prey was already marked. I broke into a jog, then a full-out sprint, the thud of my boots on the forest floor impossibly loud in my ears. I burst out of the tree line, gasping, my lungs burning, and stumbled back across the street toward the house. The hum in the air was gone, replaced by the dull roar of the freeway, a welcome, mundane sound that momentarily grounded me. I glanced back, my eyes fixed on the tree line. Just as a truck roared by on the freeway, its headlights briefly illuminating the far side of the road, I saw them, two pinpricks of light, glowing with an internal, malevolent energy, just at the edge of the woods, where I'd seen the thing. They weren't the reflective gleam of animal eyes. These were emissive, a low, cold fire in the dark. It was still there, and it was still watching. I slammed the front door shut behind me, the sound echoing hollowly through the empty house. The quiet was oppressive, filled with the phantom echoes of my own ragged breathing. I leaned against the door, my hand automatically going to my wristwatch, my thumb tracing the cold metal of the bezel, a small, meaningless gesture of control. My mind was racing, trying to process, trying to rationalize. A hallucination, too much caffeine, sleep deprivation. But my gut, that damn infallible compass for doom, knew better. It was real. Whatever it was real, and it had followed me, in spirit if not in body. The house felt like a flimsy cardboard box now, not a sanctuary. Every shadow seemed deeper, every creak of the old wood more sinister. I tried to shake it off, to dismiss it as a trick of the light, a figment of an overtired mind. I walked into the living room, trying to make myself comfortable on the worn sofa. I flicked on the small, ancient TV, hoping the mindless chatter of a late-night infomercial would drown out the ringing in my ears, the lingering cold in the air. But the images on the screen were just flickering nonsense, and the voices were background noise to the frantic hammering of my own heart. I must have drifted off for a bit, or perhaps just lost track of time in the haze of my own paranoia. My watch read 3:17 a.m. The house was dead quiet. The TV was still droning, its blue light casting an eerie glow on the walls. And then I heard it, a faint creak directly above me. My head snapped up, my senses instantly on high alert. Another creak, then the unmistakable sound of a heavy footstep. My blood ran cold. I wasn't alone. I tried to tell myself it was the house settling, or maybe a rodent, a squirrel in the attic. But the footsteps were too heavy, too rhythmic. Thump, drag, thump. It sounded like someone walking slowly, deliberately, directly in the room above the living room. The office, the locked office. My mind immediately flashed back to the gaunt figure in the woods, the glowing eyes on the other side of the freeway. A sickening dread coiled in my stomach, tightening with each soft thump. I didn't move. I couldn't. My body was a statue, frozen by a fear so profound it felt physical. I just lay there, listening, every nerve ending screaming. The footsteps continued, pacing back and forth, a relentless, unnatural rhythm. It wasn't the tentative shuffle of an animal or the light tread of a human. It was a heavy, purposeful gait, the sound amplified by the quiet of the house, by the terror in my own mind. Then, the footsteps stopped, directly above me. A different sound filled the void, a soft, metallic jingle. Then a scraping, a deliberate, slow turn of a doorknob, the one to the office. My mind raced. That door was locked. The agent had said so. I had checked it myself earlier in the evening. It was a deadbolt, solid, but the scraping continued, a persistent, chilling attempt to gain entry. The sound wasn't of someone trying a key, but of someone or something trying to force the mechanism itself, testing its resistance. I could almost hear the faint groan of the wood, the metallic protest of the lock. It was just inches from my head, separated by a thin layer of plasterboard and floorboards. I imagined the thing from the woods, its pale, emaciated face pressed against the other side of that door, its impossibly long fingers wrapped around the brass knob, its glowing eyes fixed on the empty space where it knew I lay. A shiver, colder than any winter wind, coursed through me. My skin crawled. The scraping stopped. The silence that followed was even worse. It was a waiting silence, a silence filled with anticipation. I heard a soft sigh, like air escaping a deflating tire, right above me. Then the footsteps resumed, slower now, dragging, like something was exhausted, or perhaps just bored. They moved away from the door, back towards the center of the room, then towards the back wall. Then, just as suddenly as they began, they stopped again. The house fell utterly, completely silent. Not even the hum of the freeway seemed to penetrate the oppressive quiet inside. I lay there for what felt like hours, rigid, unblinking, listening for any further sound. But there was nothing. Just the low hum of the TV and the frantic thump of my own heart, slowly beginning to decelerate from its panicked sprint. The dark outside the window began to lighten, a faint gray creeping into the black. Early dawn. Only then did the tension begin to drain from my muscles, leaving me aching and utterly drained. I must have passed out, exhausted, sometime after the first hint of sun. I woke to the insistent, high-pitched chirping of a smoke detector with a dying battery. The kind of mundane irritation that usually made me want to kick something. But this morning, it was almost a comfort. It meant the sun was up, the night was over. The first thing I did was check my watch. Almost 8 a.m. I got up, every muscle protesting, and walked towards the front door, my hand reaching for the doorknob. My fingers brushed the cold metal, and I hesitated. I had to know. I made my way upstairs, my eyes scanning every shadow, my hand instinctively going to the small, well-worn utility knife on my belt. A pathetic defense, but better than nothing. The door to the office was still closed, still locked. I approached it slowly, cautiously, like it was a live wire. My fingers brushed the brass knob. It was cold, too cold, and then I saw it. Faint, almost imperceptible against the scuffed wood of the doorframe, were thin, shallow gouges, almost like claw marks, right around the lock plate. And on the polished brass of the knob itself, where the metal met the wood, a series of tiny, almost microscopic scratches, as if something sharp had been pressed and scraped against it, again and again. It was subtle, easily missed by an untrained eye. But my eyes had been trained by years of looking for the wrongness in the world, by a lifetime of running from shadows. These were fresh. My stomach churned, a bitter bile rising in my throat. It hadn't been a dream. It hadn't been the house settling. It had been real. Whatever was out there, in those woods, had found its way inside. It had been in this house, pacing directly above me, trying to get into that room, trying to get to me. I backed away slowly, my eyes still fixed on the door, then turned and practically ran downstairs, Grabbing my go bag and keys, the air in the house still felt heavy, even with the daylight streaming through the windows. That thing, that pale, starved shadow, had been here, and it knew I was here. My core mandate was to survive, to keep moving, to avoid getting trapped. And this place, this quiet, generic house in suburban Virginia, had become a trap. I didn't bother calling the real estate agent. What would I say? Hey, your foreclosure has a pale, anorexic man-thing from the woods trying to break into the upstairs office at 3 a.m.? She'd laugh, or call the cops, or both. And I couldn't afford either of those outcomes. My history, or lack thereof, meant I couldn't stand still for scrutiny. My past was a phantom limb, always there, always hurting, always threatening to pull me back into the fire that had devoured everything I once knew in Sycamore Grove. This thing, whatever it was just another layer on that trauma, another monstrous brushstroke on the canvas of my ruined life. I drove until the sun was high in the sky, until the Virginia plate on the car behind me was a distant memory. I changed directions 3 times, took back roads I'd never seen before, just to be sure. I stopped at a diner an hour later, the greasy smell of coffee and stale bacon, a stark contrast to the cold dread still lodged in my chest. While I waited for my lukewarm coffee, I pulled out the small, battered sketchbook I always carried now. A new habit, a way to process the nightmares, to pin them to a page where I could look at them, study them, and then turn the page. My hand, still shaking slightly, began to sketch. A gaunt, elongated head, sunken eyes, a skeletal frame, the terrifying, hungry stillness. I'd read about things like this, things that stalk the lonely places, creatures born of starvation and malevolent spirits, wendigos, skinwalkers, whatever the name, it didn't matter. What mattered was that it was real, and it had found me. Just like everything else eventually did, I was a magnet for the impossible, the horrific, cursed to wander, cursed to see. The locked door had saved me this time, but there were always more doors, always more locks, and always something waiting on the other side. My world was expanding, not with horizons, but with the monstrous, and I was just the weary wanderer, caught in the widening net. Character count 9942. The taste of dust and copper, the lingering scent of ozone, and something far, far older than rot. It's a phantom echo on my tongue even now. Decades later, it wasn't a dream, not a nightmare, but the very first memory I truly owned. I saw it through a pinhole, a 7-year-old's eye peering from the darkness of a cramped hiding place, watching a monster writhe. Renan Shinan, the self-proclaimed headmaster, a man who believed himself a god of stolen time, gurgled his final, disgusting breath. Spasms, violent and uncontrolled, racked his massive body, already a mottled canvas of angry welts and black, seeping puncture wounds. The scuttling horror of the Black Widows, my silent, venomous gladiators, was finishing what years of deprivation and terror had begun. His eyes, already swelling shut, were locked in a grotesque mask of surprise and disbelief. He'd seen my face, a small, pale ghost peering down from the hole in the ceiling. And in that moment, he'd known. He'd known that even without free will, a choice had been made. And then, silence. Just the frantic tap-tapping of tiny arachnid feet receding into the cracks of the floorboards, leaving behind only the fading, putrid tang of a dying god. It all started in a place that called itself a farm, though there was nothing pastoral about it. A crumbling wooden compound fenced by tall barbed wire, surrounded by an endless, unforgiving wilderness. A place where my memory began, etched not in sunshine and laughter, but in the sterile scrawl of a single, damning truth. There is no free will. Those words, stark black paint on a warped wooden sign, were the first things I learned to read. They hung above the opposite row of bunks in the sleeping barn, a constant, sneering reminder of our collective insignificance. I had no memories from before this desolate stretch of land. No echoes of a family, a home, a name. I just was waking each day to the cold, hard floor and the perpetual gnawing in my stomach. The others were the same. We were a flock of forgotten children, some aging, some inexplicably not, all equally devoid of pasts. Memory is a funny thing, or maybe it's a cruel joke. The brain, I've heard, is supposed to shield you from too much horror, to filter out the stuff that would snap your mind like a dry twig. But for me, it's always been the opposite. My brain is a sponge for the grotesque, soaking up every agonizing detail and replaying it on an endless loop. And this farm, this was where the loop began, a foundational trauma, a blueprint for every bad thing that would come after. It wasn't just a place, it was a factory for nightmares, and I was one of its products. We were always agonizingly hungry. 3 meager meals a day, if you could call them that. Before each serving, Headmaster Ranon Sinon, a man whose voice scraped like rusty hinges and whose breath smelled of stale blood and old dust, would conduct his macabre ritual. He'd stand over a common trough, a glint in his cold, reptilian eyes, and sprinkle a few drops of clear liquid from a labelless brown bottle onto the food. Then, he'd serve behind a steel door, sliding out each plate through a small, grimy window. You never knew if your meal was poisoned. The air would thicken with a silent, desperate tension. Most of them, pale and skeletal, would dance around the edges of our plates, pushing a single grain of rice, sniffing the watery broth. No one was eager to dive in, not after seeing a dozen kids turn blue and die right in front of us, collapsing in silent, spasmodic agony after picking the wrong, or perhaps the right meal. I never ate from my plate. Call it instinct, call it pure, desperate paranoia, but a deep, churning dread always kept my hand from reaching. Instead, I'd scavenge. The garbage pile behind the kitchen was my feast, a treasure trove of moldy crusts, discarded bones, anything that hadn't touched the poisoned plates. I became a connoisseur of the forgotten, the overlooked. 4 crows, picked clean and dry, found their way into my mouth over the years. I went full Renfield, a grimy, feral thing, eating flies, ants, dandelions, cockroaches, clovers, pillbugs, anything living and somewhat edible. I kept the spiders, though, black widows, specifically. They had a special place, a secret hoard, a hunger for survival. So primal it bordered on monstrous, had been hammered into me. My old analog wristwatch, the one I absent-mindedly check now, even when I don't care about the time, is a modern affectation. Back then, time meant nothing. Only the next scrap, the next hidden breath, the next escape from Xenon's omnipresent terror. The 20 boys and 30-odd girls were the farm's workforce. We toiled in the fields from sunup to sundown, our small, brittle bodies providing all the food for this crumbling compound. There were no spotlights, no overt guards, yet the farm was far more inescapable than any prison. Every few weeks, Zenon would herd the nearly 100 of us to the edge of his property, to a desolate patch near the rusted barbed wire. There, he would blow a strange brass whistle, and from the underbrush, as if conjured from the very earth, bloodshot German shepherds would spring, their mouths foamed, their teeth gnashed on the wire, threatening to break through and tear us apart. Zenon would smile, a cold, predatory curve of his lips, and his voice, sounding like gunshots fired far away, would boom, their old guard dogs gone rabid. I have learned, through one of you, how to train them so they only obey me, and if you run, they will kill you, or make you wish you stayed here with me. The farm never offered answers. Only the hum of fear and the rasp of our own ragged breaths. Very few outsiders ever came. The rare, dented delivery trucks, a single grim prison bus that I never saw anyone leave or enter, and, most terrifyingly, a black tinted window Thunderbird. That car didn't just drive, it roared. A deep, powerful turbine sound, as if rocket engines were installed under the hood. It dealt only with the headmaster, and only one person ever left with the driver of that car, a child, picked from our ranks, their eyes wide and vacant as they disappeared into the darkness of the luxury vehicle. A rumor, whispered in hushed, terrified tones, circulated among us. We weren't real kids at all. Headmaster Jinan, some said, was a demon crafting us from blood and ash. We never dared speak to him, never dared ask a question. A question meant a touch from his hard, cruel hand, a hand that made the surrounding air a pincushion of pain. The sting would lash at your skin even if his fingers merely grazed yours. It was a tangible, invisible assault, a psychic burn that left no marks, only searing agony. But above the poisonings, the backbreaking labor, the desperate scavenging, and the gnawing uncertainty of each day, we feared the night's worst of all. Being exhausted from working in the fields all day wasn't enough to overcome the primal terror that kept us awake. When it was darkest, when the air fell still and cold in the drafty barn, we would hear the headmaster's creaking footsteps. They didn't approach from outside. They would simply appear in the center of the barn, on the roof, scuttling up the walls, across the ceiling. I can still hear his breathing if I close my eyes. That sick pig's wheezing, agonized rasp, sucking air in and out in a guttural exhaust. The breathing and the footsteps would circle and circle, a predator's endless patrol, until he heard someone cry out, a whimper of terror, a sob of exhaustion. That's when the taken would give one last, choked cry before they were gone. Along with the headmaster, the missing child would return to their beds in the morning, always bearing new marks. A glancing finger left a nasty red and purple smear on a rib cage. Sometimes black, ink-like fingertips dotted their bodies, as if a charred hand had pressed down. We never spoke of these marks, never even glanced at them too long. We were always afraid the headmaster would hear and give us matching marks, or worse, marks from his boots. Sometimes he would touch you with his entire palm, leaving an invisible, wrinkled imprint, as raw and painful as a hot iron brand. I had a few of those marks myself, phantom pains that would flare up years later, sometimes in the middle of a peaceful night, reminding me of that unbearable farm. But even then, amidst the constant terror, I considered myself lucky. I had only a few marks, as far as I could tell. It was a small mercy in a life devoid of them. I was one of 4 boys and 5 girls chosen for house duty. We cleaned the headmaster's home, the farmhouse itself. I drew the short straw most days and cleaned the bathrooms, emptying out the shit cisterns with a slop bucket and rope. The stench was beyond description, a visceral, gagging horror that lingered in your nostrils for hours. It was while scrubbing for mildew, standing on the windowsill to reach a particularly stubborn patch, that I found them, a few loose ceiling boards directly above his toilet. They were almost imperceptible, camouflaged by dust and neglect. A tiny flicker of an idea sparked in my starved, terrified brain. This was my life for what felt like endless years. I swore I could have named 25 separate times the frost came, marking the passage of winters, but we had no way of keeping track of time, not even by our own apparent ages. Sometimes I swore I'd see a kid go from looking 13 or 14 back down to looking half that. Time made no sense at the farm. It flowed like a broken tap, sometimes rushing, sometimes freezing, sometimes reversing. I knew then, with a chilling certainty, that I wasn't going to get out by waiting. My future, whatever it was, wasn't going to be handed to me. It would have to be clawed from the jaws of Zinan's cruelty. One morning, I woke to a searing, hot pain on my upper arm. A vivid, angry red handprint burned into my flesh, precisely where Headmaster Ranan Sinon had brushed against me the previous day. It was deep, almost to the bone, and throbbed with a pain that transcended the physical. It wasn't a casual touch. It was a brand, a possessive mark, and in that moment, a hazy, starvation-induced plan, one that had been simmering in the back of my mind for months, emerged from the fog of my brain, sharp and terrifyingly clear. My go bag, the one I keep packed now, a constant companion in the passenger seat of my rig, wasn't a thing back then. But the mindset of a go bag, of meticulous preparation for flight or fight, was born then. I went to the special place by the cisterns, behind a false brick on the side of the farmhouse, where the sewage pipes were hidden from casual view. I had kept every black widow spider I'd come across. I'd started with 8, finding them cannibals when grouped. So I'd kept hosting my own macabre tournaments, pitting them against each other, watching the strongest, most venomous ones consume the weaker. By that morning, the original 108 black widows I'd collected had been reduced to 26 of the most toxic, twitchy, and bite-crazy widows you'd ever wish not to meet. I'd been bitten only twice during my gruesome breeding project, and both times I'd come terrifyingly close to an agonizing death, my small body convulsing, my vision blurring, my heart hammering against my ribs like a trapped bird. But I'd survived. I knew one bite wouldn't do a monster like Xenon in, but 26? That was a different story. I was set. I was ready to enact the last stage of my plan when everything changed on a cold day in early December. A helicopter, as black as the Thunderbird, made a couple of low, unsettling circles over the farm, its rotors chopping at the silent air like an angry god. The sight of that helicopter, an external force intruding on Xenon's isolated kingdom, snapped something in him. He went completely, violently insane. The very next day, he poisoned half of the meals, a frantic, desperate act of control. After breakfast, a horrifying silence fell. He took us all outside, herding us into a ragged queue outside the chicken slaughterhouse, a place of bloody, visceral death that usually only saw the headless carcasses of birds. When he began leading us in, one by one, a few of the older kids, eyes wide with terror, suddenly broke ranks. They ran. I joined them, a desperate, animalistic sprint towards the barbed wire, towards the woods. Judging from the screams that tore through the air moments later, he caught most of the runners, but he didn't catch me. I'd spent countless nights fantasizing about this moment, when I wasn't listening to his phantom footsteps or his sick, rasping breath. Every fiber of my being was primed for escape. I had the black widows secured inside an old, compartmentalized chocolate box I'd scavenged from a woodpile, perfect for keeping each venomous beauty locked away in its own tiny cell. My heart pounded, a frantic drum against my ribs. I scrambled up through the loose floorboards in the bathroom, pulling myself into the cramped, dust-choked space above the toilet. The air was thick with the scent of mildew and stale air, but it was a sanctuary. The headmaster, in his paranoia, might not sleep through the night, but everyone's gotta go eventually. Even monsters. Those cisterns didn't shit themselves. I pulled the planks back into place, listening for anything. It was dark by the time he arrived. The farmhouse had no electricity, only the flickering, sickly glow of a single candle he carried, its weak light casting grotesque, dancing shadows. I heard him pull down his trousers, the coarse fabric rasping against itself, followed by his guttural grunt of effort. That familiar, disgusting sound masked the faint creak of me moving the planks above him aside. My hand, trembling but steady, pulled the lid off the chocolate box. 26 nightmares, 26 pinpricks of pure, concentrated venom showered down upon the headmaster. My beauties began biting as soon as they landed. They were ravenous, crazed gladiators, primed for destruction. The terror of the child farm, The demon named Ranan Shinan curled around his toilet, a grotesque parody of human vulnerability. His eyes, already swelling shut from the initial bites, were locked in a disgusted, surprised, and utterly outraged gurgle of horror. Spasms, violent and uncontrolled, racked his whole body, his limbs jerking like a puppet on cut strings. Before his eyes swelled completely shut, before the darkness claimed him, he saw my face, my small, 7-year-old face, peering down the hole in the darkness. The missing child, the one who had escaped. A strange, wet gurgle erupted from his throat, transforming into a horrifying cackle. It was a sound that would haunt my sleep for years, a deranged symphony of triumph and defeat. "I knew this could happen," he rasped, his voice thick and wet, barely intelligible. "There is no free will. It's fine. I lived 10,000 years already. I lived your happy summers, wonderful marriages, fruitful successes. Your life was beautiful beyond compare. That's why He smashed a few spiders scuttling around his face. A last, pathetic attempt at defiance, but I could tell he was fading fast. "You and I are ghosts now," were his last intelligible words before the headmaster's breathing stopped. The last wet gurgle, the last shuddering spasm, and then silence. Just the frantic tap-tapping of tiny arachnid feet receding into the cracks of the floorboards, leaving behind only the fading, putrid tang of a dying god. I hid for 4 hours, my body stiff with terror and adrenaline, before carefully making my way to the window, the safest place in the room. The spiders were done and gone. The chopper returned just before sunrise, its thudding rotors stirring the dawn air. It wasn't alone this time. A convoy of armed men, dressed in dark, tactical gear, streamed from the woods. I was the only survivor they found. The captain of the operation was a man named Clinton Moxley, chief field investigator for something called the Secured Bureau of Reclamation. He adopted me. He said I knew him from before. He even said he was able to find me due to tracers injected into me years ago. He named me Howard. I told my new father what little I knew, what fragments Xenon's torture had left me with. He corrected me on a few things, piecing together a narrative that felt too neat. He chooses victims who had good lives, my father would explain as he would tuck me in, his voice calm, reassuring, almost clinical. His existence is the greatest evidence that time is a physical dimension, something that exists and can be crafted and stolen. He lives your years in just a few seconds. We believe he is responsible for over 100,000 homeless children across the world. Another young human with a frail, old, used-up timeline. I asked the only father I knew why he adopted me, why he chose me. He brought me to the master bathroom's dual mirrors and told me to take off my shirt. "Because I owe you," he said, his eyes solemn, meeting mine in the reflection. "You were an old man once, Howard. You were my partner within the Bureau. You were sent into the farm by yourself to try to shut it down. I will make sure you get the help you need to remember. I had hoped that you would remember something about your past on your own, but I see the headmaster got to you too." I looked behind me, using the set of mirrors to see my own back for the first time. It was covered in faded, but still visible, handprints, some angry red, some dark purple, some the faint, indelible black of fingertips. The marks of Xenon, a permanent legacy on my skin. That was many years ago. True to Headmaster's twisted words, I have been a ghost among the living ever since, a shadow flitting through the world, disconnected, detached. Every job I take, every town I pass through, feels transient, temporary. The worn leather jacket I always wear, the one that feels like a second skin, is less a fashion statement and more a uniform of a life perpetually on the run. My old analog wristwatch, a nervous tick I developed somewhere along the lonely highways, is a desperate attempt to ground myself in a reality that feels increasingly fragile. It's been hard even sleeping, especially now. For the past few nights, The chill that settles around my bed isn't just the autumn air. I hear them. The headmaster's creaking footsteps, the sickening rasp of his breath, right there in the darkness. A phantom presence I can almost feel reaching for me. My father never said they found the headmaster's body. No one ever did. He wants his farm back. He wants me back. He wants all his children back. And sometimes, usually in the quiet hours before dawn, I can almost hear their silent, hungry pleas, rising from the earth, calling me home. The truth is, I've always been running from something far more fundamental than a single monster. I'm running from a past that isn't just mine, from a borrowed life, from the chilling, undeniable whisper that Sinan's farm, his twisted timeline, is still out there, calling me back to where my story truly began. And maybe deep down, a part of me, the part that's truly weary, wonders if I was ever meant to escape at all. Total character count, 9,788 characters.